Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the time analysis is specifically is actually generally densifying the cities in the mountains. And you see that there's and then the next case study specifically, where that is, and how can we so I can just listen to as an experimentation, design, and I like this.
Yeah, I
It
think
was just my improvisation.
No, you're good. You're good. I thought this was enough to kind of like get the brief going. It's like basically continue and kind of this process of research. The first part of the process. Different parts in terms of public private show how you connect people. Thinking of the units.
I just brought some land.
Space that can be combined with other types of spaces.
I like it to show that it's I'm sure we will take it. And then you can next. All the way to each of them is not the same.
Maybe now is the time.
It's not like a repetition of them. It's really the multiple elements while the experiment can implement. You have a specific ideas. And always comes back.
Yes.
So you know that there are specific topics in each. So it's not about just having formats. This is just one side. So your works will have.
Thank you.
I'm making a couple audits for some reason. It's not looking very happy. It's already still the first half, but it's just like the shifted down to the slots.
How is it? Do you need me?
Sure.
100%.
Okay, And this table we need to remove as well because we have oaks here. Could you guys remove this table as well? Please, because people should sit on that.
They should sit around
Yes.
the reviewers.
That's why I wanted to people to see my face.
So we need to do this.
And if students present the chair here, the model this thing is more far away than here.
We're just back there.
And what do you think, where should we position this one?
The
If
camera?
the people sit here and here. Our camera is good, yes? So people better sit next.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. The camera is really just supposed to capture the
I'm Matt Luck, I believe I'm on your
Hey,
review.
We're all
Yeah, I saw the,
YouTube and everything.
saw your bio.
Oh, it's a great bio.
Said partner at Studio Left.
I know, I almost changed that, but I thought this is the best bio ever. So true.
Yeah, we'll give introductions here in a second. If you want to say anything else about yourself.
Okay, do you like want 5 minutes or something? I mean, I don't know, okay.
No, just briefly.
Do what?
Just briefly, like whatever you want to say.
Oh, sure, yeah, that's,
I think it's better to be here closer to the setup.
sure.
We would like to ask you maybe to come a bit closer due to the setup of the microphone. So just to be here is great. Yes. When you say the comments, it's better
Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. We're next door.
Ah, okay, so.
Introducing. Okay. Morning, everybody. Quickly, we'll just introduce kind of the project brief and the reviewers. So we have Matt Luck, who is a partner at Studio Luck. I don't know if you want to say anything else about yourself briefly. But...
Sure, yeah, let's see. Yeah, our office is about 3 years old in Austin. I worked at, I was the senior architect at Studio Rick Joy in Tucson for about 9 years prior. Yeah, went to Cornell.
And we have Stephanie Choi over here, who her work focuses on expanding architectural dialogue through interdisciplinary inquiry and engaging in larger conversations about our social makeup in the world. And her most recent studio focused on looking at different, I guess, not health crises, but health
Medical controversies.
Yes, and kind of how we tackle those in the future. So very interested in how we think about civic futures and kind of how we address future through architecture. And then Danelle Briscoe, from midterm. Daniel the other day described her as a BIM expert. I think that's a great way to describe her, but she's very interested in architectural technologies and how that relates to construction, and is always very thoughtful when it comes to integrating landscape into architectural design. And then I'm hoping I'll pronounce this wrong, but Kiru?
How'd it go? Yeah, that was good.
Okay.
Thank you.
And she's a project designer at Michael Shu's office and has experience in New York, Hong Kong, and Nigeria as well, and the UK.
Yes, I have to say I just stepped away from my shoes.
Okay.
Show office any longer, but
Okay. Good to know. Well, thank you all for joining us. Okay. So this semester we wanted to look at, the prompt for kind of the second years was this idea of urban ecologies and doing a multifamily housing project. And for us, kind of this idea of, Ross and I, the idea was, of urban ecology is how do we begin to integrate kind of these natural voids into larger, denser urban spaces, whether it be these kind of communal spaces like space blocked in the way that you see on the right, or kind of these larger ideas of landscape and how that gets integrated into larger urban structures, as you see on the left. And so the studio kind of started out for every second year student, we had to do, there were kind of like 4 different assignments that they all went through. First being a case study of kind of these types of projects that we were interested in and kind of what we thought addressed urban ecologies in an interesting way. And then they would pick their own sites along kind of East Austin, specifically East 7th Street, and have some sort of argument for why they chose that site. And then from there, they would design kind of their unit, which varies from private to public and semi-private. And then from there, they would begin to create the building. So this is the transect in which they were exploring and kind of where they were choosing their sites. So this is East 7th, all the way on the west side, you have I-35, and it goes all the way east to Springdale. And what we were kind of interested in is how, like, as you can see in this image here, just to the north in the kind of more residential areas is very, there's tons of green space, lots of kind of historical trees and old growth that happens in that area. But as you go south and kind of into the transect where we're exploring, you see how, like, the density that is happening over in East Austin is getting rid of a lot of this natural landscape. And so we wanted to kind of think about how can we begin to bring that back and some of the ideas of natural voids as well.
By the site analysis, we were looking at certain issues, such as what kind of different perspectives interweaves within the existing content. So how the natural void is appearing in our transect, how the human void, what it is, what could it be, and like how this part of the natural void, is there integrated or is it leftover piece, or is it thought about? About the access, human access actually, how we access the building, where the walkable areas are. And we looked as well about non-human void, such as the traffic, concrete areas for parking, for streets, which is thought mostly for the car, for the parking, for the transportation, how those actual layers interweave as an internal granularities. We also recognize that the program diversity in our Transect was very diverse and very multiple aspects explored, and have some specific unique aspects as well, such as public and private is interweaving quite interestingly, but fragmentally and separated next to each other. We want to keep densification logic that is diverse in its programs and the lifestyles, like for the East Austin. That was like our site analysis to look into every group or setup of students was looking at those issues. And for the case studies, we gave the students to analyze specific relationships. So how the green void and a natural void actually, it could be interwoven in specific key projects, such as like green to be seen as an interior or as a courtyard in the apartment in itself, like a smaller granularity, or seeing this as inflaming around from the outside, so reverse strategy. So we saw those compositional issues as part of our design strategies, as well as a group work. So every group of the student was analyzing those key projects for the case studies part. And we saw as well how the navigation in itself as a setup could be part of nature. By entering the building, the circulation is not just functional, not just a function, not just an access, but it becomes a part of nature. So those strategies were analyzed. And as well, we experimented how the simple elements of the building, exploring by key studies and experimenting within the larger scale, like we thought urban ecologies, how could this be a larger topic, not just a smaller granularity singular element, but like turning in a larger whole, where becomes additional part such as connectivities and interweaving those elements of greeneries. Massive areas and additional void areas appear for those multiple diverse scenarios, lifestyle scenarios.
Yeah, and so continuing kind of the sort of research by design that Rasa is doing in her half with with the students, I wanted to kind of continue that sort of same idea and thinking about how do the students begin to kind of dip their toes into what computational design is as well, when thinking about how they begin to construct these projects. So this quote from Mario Carpo seemed very relevant about talking about how we not just use digital tools to design a building, but rather design a building that would not have been able to been created without that. And so for so continuing to kind of do research by design, I wanted the students to think about the units, these housing units as different parts. And so we look at it as similar to how we might think about an alphabet. So we have each part, you might have a public unit, a private unit, semi-private, semi-public. But no matter how they're combined, similar to letters, they can begin to create unlimited amount of variation in the space. And so students would begin to design and explore that by first designing units, and then later allowing them to aggregate and create different types of public and private spaces, and essentially a new housing type that, again, integrated, kind of looked at different relationships between these public and private spaces, but also began to integrate the landscape and these kind of natural voids that we've been looking at throughout the semester. So from here, they would take these studies and ultimately try to realize these into some sort of building.
So we have the first student showing his own version of the design, his own design results for the environment ecologies.
Colin, you ready?
Okay, so good morning. My name is Colin Harris, and I don't have to talk about this a lot because it was just covered by our professors, but I just wanted to show the larger site context that we looked at, which was 7th Street here in Austin. And as a class, we all looked at 7th, but we subdivided it further into 4 or 5 plots, and this was ours. It was between the streets of Prospect and Pleasant Valley, and we were fairly lucky. Up there in the upper right, we have Boggy Creek, which is the only park besides the graveyard along our entire site's run. But more important than that, before we looked at like a larger Austin study, and in my group we looked at trees. And what's being shown here on this GIS map is the darker greens is just tree cover, and the lighter greens are heritage trees. So heritage trees are registered, and they can't be torn down without like excessive, or not necessarily excessive, but with a lot of paperwork, and it takes, so they're there to stay essentially, and then they're usually much larger and more impressive. So you can see past I-35, thank you, sorry, so excited, I didn't, but so past I-35, east of it, the heritage tree, there's an extremely sharp drop off. And it's even worse along 7th, which is here. So, and that was something that really interested me because it seemed like it's a dramatic and extremely easy to tell story. The lack of vertical greenery, and that was something that I wanted to address with my project. And so so I knew I wanted something tall, and I knew I wanted something with a lot of verticality. So the first thing that I did was I had these units that sort of tapered up, and then there was space created underneath them, because the benefit of trees is not only that you can see them from far away, you can also enjoy like sort of basking underneath them, which is something that I wanted. I wanted to create a space beneath my building that would sort of operate like a tree space, and that's what I did here at first. And that pole was something that I really liked, but it had the obvious problem of like, no one's gonna be able to grow anything past 8 feet, right? So, but it was from this that my real project sort of started to develop. This is just an idea that I had. This is my first sort of iteration of the project. I wanted communal gardening space, and I have these, this is like a plotting plan, because I wanted space for people to enjoy, but then also sort of assign an ambitious urban farming deal, and then also later chickens would be added to that. But so what was great about this was that the circulation, instead of being like additive, it was the cores around which everything was built. That's what those big spiraling staircases are. So all the units would sort of hang off of them, and then they would be connected by sinuous tendons that formed. And so the first thing that I did was I had to make a core. I imagined it being an elevator surrounded by stairs, and then a sort of flower pot that spiraled along with it so that there was greenery all the way up. And then each of my cores, I wanted to try to create different spaces. Each of them I knew I wanted a balcony on each of them, because a big part of it was as they sort of connected or almost connected, and then those sinews would come in and really solidify those connections, they needed to branch off of something, which I wanted to be the landings that I have there. And just like the Jean Renardi project is what really started this, he dealt with really like dramatic sharp angles, and I've got these very soft circles, maybe too circular. And just like with that, as the units stack, the landings start to take different shapes because they're being informed by the other landings that they connect to. This is my second unit. It's the only one that's double spaced. And it also has a spiral staircase inside of it, which meant I didn't need to connect further. I didn't need to connect the landing or the stairs to that upper space. And then this is my third unit. And my final unit was inside the cores. And at first it was circular, which was good for the profile, but it was essentially unlivable. So that was expanded upon to have a little output, and it became much more viable, and it didn't end up messing with the overall form. And putting all of those together gave one core, and then I just needed to put each of those. But before I could do that, I needed a spot on the site. So this was our site, Prospect and Pleasant, like I said. And initially, I had considered in the southern west, there's this big building here, is an HEB office building. But as I went and explored the site, I discovered that was actually fairly integral. It was one of the only interesting buildings there. It was extremely old. It had used to be a railway workshop for this, and so it wouldn't have felt right to demolish, so I needed something else. And I discovered that, so initially I thought that all of this was part of the park, and it turns out that's not true. It's like overgrown, it's terrible. It has these trees, which are nice, but everything else it's just a bunch of weeds, and just right next to it is where the park begins, and that's the park center, and the visitor center and everything. And it's doubly good because right across from it is a bus stop, and then across from that is an HEB. And this is Boggy Creek, which is around which the park is organized. So that's where I ended up putting it. It's replacing an abandoned Sonic and a auto repair shop, of which there are many along this transit. There's another one that's like right over here in one of those three buildings, so it didn't feel like a terrible loss. And then that site was also good because there was, I know we didn't really have to address parking, but there was enough space for parking. So this is what it looks like on the site, and this is the whole thing assembled. There are 51 units, and you can kind of see the connections that I was talking about. It's really much easier to see and like rotate with the model that I have. Do you mind if I like hand that to you guys? It's kind of heavy and big.
Well, yeah, as long as we don't break it.
It is what it is. it's sort of stable. I don't know.
Thank you.
And then here's a section which just shows which really just shows the living in the cores and the terracing that is also more evident in the model. And then this is my render because one thing we talked about from the very beginning was chicken farming, urban chicken farming. I grew up in Austin and one of my very good friends had a chicken farm. It was like 7 chickens or something. And he would bring eggs to school and it was pretty great. And I talked to Rasa about that a lot. And that was something that I wanted to facilitate. And this also sort of shows how it would meet the ground in a sort of very similar sinuous way that just connects all the cores and there's a space cultivated under there where you might have a market or just meet up and enjoy shade. And I know like this over dramatic lighting is like kind of a classic architecture student thing to do to hide a bad render, but in this case, it also shows the sort of the canopy effect that I was talking about earlier, where you can see light shining through these trees and creating an interesting shadow, and then likewise, it'll shine through the core and hit the ground at different angles. And so these are all my plans. They're really, they're rendered much nicer on the plot that I have over there, but I guess what this shows best is just the plotting plan. And if I can have a direct response here, I don't know if that's wholly appropriate, but during my mid-review, I was told that it was like fairly naive by Professor Visco to imagine that, because it's divided by sunlight, like apples and pears and heavy fruits, they need a lot more sun than cabbages and peas. And so I used that, and then in the most shaded spot, I put chicken coops. And so I was told that that wasn't really necessarily how the world works, which I understand, and is like true, but I don't think there's anything wrong. Like at worst, I think it's romantic to pursue a more natural farming, and at worst it's romantic, and at best it's I guess noble. This is just, they keep going, and the spaces towards the south, you can see where the sun will hit, have a lot more of those reds and oranges, and then as you get into the more shadowy bits, you have the cabbages and the lettuces and the herbs. And that's my project.
Can you walk us through the circulation?
Yes.
Because there's a few units that are a little less clear to me.
Like, do you have a particular one in mind, or? So
maybe just take us through the building and start from the ground and.
Okay. So this is where their crochet is obviously where the cut line is, so they're all going to be spiraling in that direction. I don't know exactly how much
So
I need
is,
to.
you go up each core to like how many units?
51 units.
How many units attached to that core?
Oh, it varies from each core. So the ones with, they're essentially divided into 4, like they do a quarter turn every 10 feet. So or every 11 feet, so there's a unit every 11 feet. And there's a unit attached to almost every quarter turn.
Do you have a private elevator entry, so it just opens up to your unit, or is it?
No, the elevator would open up to the circulation, which might then lead directly to your unit, like here. Although, yeah, like here. The elevator opens up, goes to the circulation, but you can also just continue on into the private unit.
But 3 of these, there's 4 cores that are units themselves. They look like studios.
Yes.
Okay, so they don't have.
No, there's 5. I'm sorry, there's 5 cores that are studios.
Okay, so they don't have elevator.
They don't have elevators.
They're only walkable.
They're only walkable, but then each of those connects somewhere well, I guess not each of them, but many of them connect to a core with an elevator, so it felt redundant to have every single one be an elevator, which is what initially introduced having those cores be different.
Okay, so there's an inner and outer in a lot of these. There's an inner studio and an outer apartment that's multi-bedroom. Okay, can we go to the next one? And do they share terraces? Some are private, some are public?
Yes, some are private, some are public. Usually,
So this one is public, presumably,
Yeah.
the larger one.
and then some of them are just semi-public. There's only a couple of units that connect to them. Do you mind if I unpin this and just put it on the floor and talk about it? It's like, this whole thing feels awkward as well. I'm not really displayed on that at all. I know this is just for the digital presentation.
Should I rotate this first?
Yes, please.
Sideways.
And this is the top, and that's the bottom, and the first down, and then sort of abstract.
Yeah, I think your model is very nicely made and definitely expresses your canopy goal. I do think it's curious that there's no ground frame that is represented at all, how it connects to the primary access or any pathways leading to the farm. They just sort of float in the space, and so it's not easy to speak to the connection to the greater community here, but also very isolated. So that's that. And then the other thing is, I think your unit and your module has an inherent infrastructure to it, these sort of cores and trays, and there's some massiveness to that. I'm not sure what the material is, but in the rendering they seem very concrete, right? So that gives it a very heavy, weighty character. And when all of that gets stacked, it's not a relationship that really lends itself to canopy foliage feeling. You end up with very dark spaces, actually. And I'm not sure how far you are into computation, but it would be amazing to set up a script that actually reduces and peels away that massiveness as you add more, so that it's not always this 50-50 relationship, because you want to sort of cut back on the massiveness as you're adding more units to allow it to open up. But you would have to add in to your program plus certain units, plus X number of units, subtract X number of railing and terrace and hard surface, so that you would eventually get to that kind of like feeling. With that, even with the help of some software or formula that you derive for yourself.
We're just looking at each unit and those decisions.
Right, and not just
And
not
not just repeating something that isn't logical. None of your units have windows.
Not true, but maybe none of them are drawn very well.
I don't see one
None of them
window.
are drawn, period.
I have windows
If you have to search for it,
here. Yeah. This is true.
I mean, I don't see how in your studies you wouldn't have considered light inside.
I guess I really was sort of hoping that by giving each unit a terrace or a sort of, this doesn't seem to be working right now, but
People do live inside their unit.
of course.
They're not always going to be outside on the terrace. Yes, that's an amenity, but when you're looking at a unit, you're placing a bed, you're placing any of these spaces, even the ones that are very private, like the bathroom, should have light. Otherwise, they have to turn on a switch that is a drain from a source that's not, it shouldn't be overlooked. You shouldn't take that for granted. And to just repeat that is, in my mind, irresponsible. And I feel like you had a very strong project at mid-review. What was that?
Aaron, 3 weeks ago. And I don't see anything that has been improved upon.
Mhm.
But what have you done since the midterm?
Well, during the midterm, I only had this plan, and it was much taller. And so since then, I developed all the other, the tendons, the connections, and
I don't mean to come down on you so.
I'll live, it's fine.
I know, okay, good. Because what was just said about the site relationship was mentioned, we still don't see a site plan. This is a floating object. This is a object in a space approach that isn't giving us an urban condition. You're not wanting to deal with the ground plane, which is where you could place an urban farm and not have to go through all the expenses of putting it up in the air where you're not getting the proper amount of light. And so I guess I'm frustrated because I want to see this kind of intention with incorporating urban farming. Yes, chickens, great. I want that to happen and to be a part of what you're considering, but it's just so far removed from the reality of it. And it's still in the same location that it was 3 weeks ago when it was discussed as not having enough light to do.
Well, okay. I agree with many of these comments in general. I think for me, so to start with the premise of the studio and of your process, what I think is interesting, first of all, is like the relationship to urban farming, designing for non-humans, right? You're talking, the chickens have come up a lot, and I think that's super interesting, right? Which is that the chicken is your client, so design specifically for the scale of the chicken, right? So design for the scale, for the needs of the cabbage, peas, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that, this relationship to ground has been brought up, and I suspect maybe we'll see that in a number of other projects. Let's see, but of course, as been mentioned, there is no relationship to ground. This is adding a lot of density to Austin that, in a way, we rarely see that disconnect from ground so much. So again, there's that. But I think for me, when I look at these units, were you looking at like metabolist architects, for example? Because they're very much, if the premise of the studio is starting from the module of the apartment and thinking through a number of different living arrangements, right? Studio, one bedroom, family, multifamily, multi-generational, that when I look at these units, it seems that the interior studio units don't have very much light. It seems like you circulate around them. When I look at the model, and it's legitimately dark under there, especially for this poor unit on the ground floor. And then you have the unit that wraps around, and when I look at these unit plans, it's essentially all circular corridor. I need a custom curved couch.
Yeah.
Right, so as you drew this, you're realizing that I have a very, very long curved closet right here, and I have nowhere to hang out. I have no couch, I have no living room, right? That to me, I'm totally fine with integrating the core. You have a circular core, elevator in the middle, sure, like that can totally work. But then it seems that the form of the thing coming off, like you're starting to do this here where you're like, okay, I need a square box to like accommodate living needs, have some light, natural light for all by code, which you need, right, as you're familiar with. And it seems to me that maybe more effort could have been put into making that a really nice unit that comes off the core, so that it's less about shaping the overall form and making it fit, but then that this aggregation is the thing that you're working with, and then it's going to be about scripting. How do I manage to get natural light for all of these things, right? So the Moshi Safety habitat, it's like most of it is carved out underneath. It's really like a stepped project, and it's terraced up, right? So you don't have any dark units on the underside. All of them are getting natural daylight. So I think there's a carving project in here. But then I feel that the thing that, the way you had to resolve this is that everything becomes corridor, even the planting here, like there's really nowhere to hang out on these large terraces that you provide. And it seems that, is that at the third level, that the majority of the kind of open area is at this podium level. So I really worry that all the units underneath are really suffering, right? So you've like essentially elevated ground, but then when you elevate the ground, it's taken up by, there's nowhere for me as a human to sit, right? So everything is these narrow 3-foot corridors and it's for planting, but it's not really for, it's not communal, it's not really congregating, right? So I think there's this element of the unit, of the apartments, and then also what's most advantageous for all your non-human clients, right? For your chicken coop, your cabbage, et cetera. They want to be, there's a real optimal relationship to sunshine. Some of them have different needs for sunshine, right? So these start to be things that can be factored into your script, essentially, right? Is these needs, these desires for sunlight. And then I think maybe I think the approach is there, but as you drew through this, it seems that there are clearly some issues, right? That I'm seeing in all of the apartments, the curved kitchens, everything, the custom furniture that seem to be maybe less conducive to living, right? To flexibility, to these kind of basic needs.
I think that's where the frustration comes, is that you saw that and you chose to ignore it because, I don't know, at one point maybe you figured it wasn't important, but that's critical and core to having a credible proposal. So immediately if you ignore that, you're just setting yourself up to present something that is not really taken seriously, which is a shame because you put in a lot of time and effort into it. And I think you can't, you face the design problem, you have to solve for it. You can't just ignore it and try and push past it and think it's going to be okay on the other side because and you're doing yourself a disservice. So I think the scale is off for your trades and your attitude to the planting. I think there's an incredible opportunity to pivot units around your circular core that did have balconies that were private, could be the planting area, and rotate those to allow light to filter through to the bottom. It was a larger communal area. And there you have an interesting project, and in your rotation, each turn is allowing more light to come through, but you don't end up with these massive terraces that block light and do the opposite of actually what you were wanting to do. And the round apartment, I'm not sure if it would have been, I think it would actually have been better to just keep to the conventional rectangular unit. I see some of them over here in the corner, and I think actually the way they rotate off of each other on this model is very interesting. And then you come in with the curved public space that wraps around more rectangular units, and how the two interact becomes an interesting conversation. Carving out, it can't work everywhere as this round module. It's just not efficient or unworkable.
Who do you imagine as the people that would be living here?
Well, one of the things that I liked was that each of the units is at a different scale, like minorly. Like the double space unit is almost 3 times the size of these units, and it's almost 4 times the size of those core units. So, I mean, I imagine, to be honest, people who were interested, because I was somewhat cognizant, I guess, of like a farm is a workspace, essentially. So like this is less fun than it is work. So I figured, I mean, it would attract an audience who was aware of that. And then
I mean, the only reason I ask is that, again, it's hard to disagree with any of the previous comments. It's just that in East Austin, I live in East Austin and my office is there. And I just think that it's there's a certain insensitivity to the project, especially being in East Austin, which has historically been Black neighborhood, Hispanic neighborhood, and this sort of, again, I'm not sure that the right word is, there's a sort of a lack of human dignity that you've given to the people who will live here, just based on the lack of energy and focus on your project. Yeah, I feel like you've given maybe more energy just to the farming aspect than to the actual occupants of the building. And that can be traced back to how you're expressing like a lack of windows and the lack of, just human occupancy and comfort. But I think it goes further back maybe to your analysis of East Austin, which you found that the lack of heritage trees would be the most interesting aspect of this neighborhood. And I think that puts you into this risk of becoming kind of a formalist, because you're looking at trees like strange forms, you're abstracting them into things that they really, your analysis, I couldn't recognize that it had any characteristics of a tree other than it was perpendicular to the earth, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think when you go down that path and you sort of shun these real needs of people, then you're going to end up with a project that is debatable whether it's interesting formally, but certainly doesn't reach, your aspirations never went towards, just human habitation. And I think that's maybe for me the hardest part of the project to understand. I'm not sure it's architecture. I think it's interesting form making, and you sprinkled it with some architectural ideas. But and I think the nods to things like farming, and I grew up on a farm, so it's really nice, but it really isn't. Yeah, they're not dignified with your actual attention and energy to actually make these wonderful spaces and inspiring spaces, and they kind of come off as almost like amenities and word alone. Like, oh, I added farms, and I've added, and to me that's sort of the leap you have to make, is like, how do I really like elevate these things beyond a list of amenities to something that's really inspiring and spatial, and so that's kind of my biggest takeaway from the project.
I think it's in this model, some issues which the jury discussed was also like we had this layering system like involving the light, or the opening of the void in itself. And I think that as a second year student, this first time approach, we very nicely also integrate the navigation as a thought. And as a comment says, it would be nice to have additional step, like with the potential to bring that layering, like in framing of sequences of trees as an apple, pears, within its own proportions, characters, years, and needs. And I think like ingredients and intentions are beautiful and amazing. I think it's coming from the East Boston, but representation having more scenarios which can find how people actually do it, where they integrate it. We would add this more representation or intentional, less database big. Yes, it was great as a research as a group, but more for the project specifically, like what Julie mentioned. And coming back again and looping in the project, so I think it will be a very great project. So it just needs to start to complete in order to be in a fragment of this. So it's a kind of very nice intentions for the East Boston, and something to localize actually new job opportunities, to bring diversity of people to come back to central areas. So the very nice intentions you have in the project. When we speak architecturally, as an architect, we see incompleteness in the project. Those beautiful aspects you want to bring in the top, it just doesn't speak yet in the project. So, and those fragments, it would be beautiful to see the chicken not standing on the handrail, but being there, like really setting it up and showing this relationship of layering and where this diversities of areas could be appeared, how the ground is layered. So you have a very nice setups and great intentions. It's just like the way have one more iteration for the project to be more specific goals and things rather than color coding. So compositionally, I see a start of great potential of integrating, but for professional review, having complete building, it needs more stuff, right? So, great intention.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I love the intention of like the community garden being elevated to a denser kind of idea, and like how does that get integrated into an apartment building? And I think, I've always thought that was really smart and interesting. And I think there's just a lack of resolution in the final presentation. I think you had all these great ideas about how the ground floor actually works, like with, being on a food truck park and like people activating that space, and you intentionally kind of lifted these apartments off the ground floor so that people could kind of activate that and use it like a park that it's situated next to, right? And I think the drawings just don't indicate that. I think like that one rendering you had with the chicken on the handrail, I thought it was funny, but it was like, I want to see that populated with like what's happening in that space, right? And I also think like, I still wonder if the cores should also be a moment for vertical farming as well. So you have like this kind of shared farming space that happens on the terraces, but I thought, I still think within the cores there should be some sort of living wall that happens so that, I can walk outside my apartment, grab some lettuce right off the core, and then walk back in, So, I think like Ross says, it's just a little bit further. I think there's some really great ideas that are happening, but it just needs to be pushed. And I don't know what happened with the glass in the apartments. I know you were intentional about making sure it's well lit for the rest of these units. I don't know if it's a representational thing or what.
It's just it is terrible, but it's just because I underlaid with a model that didn't have glass. And I did glass by doing 4 lines, and so the thickness is just gone. And I know that that's not inappropriate, like excuse or whatever, but.
I just don't, sorry, but I don't buy that they're there, but we just don't see them.
Okay,
Because they're not there and they're not here.
They're
I
not
don't
there.
want to harp on that part because I think you probably will have learned your lesson after this review, that how critical it is to show that kind of thing. And I don't want to discourage you from being ambitious with living walls especially and vertical farming, but look at the precedents that are available to you. It would have given you an understanding of the kind of thickness that's necessary to support even the smallest of things that you're wanting to plant. And if you have that goal and ambition in your work, which is very promising, use what's available to you in research and go beyond what might have been the initial research of the studio. Go into your own investigation and curiosity that will give you some of the forces that change what you're doing. It's not isolated. It's about understanding what these intentions would need. Like, that's your client, the plants are your client, the chickens are your client, as was said, and I totally agree with that. And it would just give you such a different proposal if that were how you were driving it.
I hate to be so defensive. So just really quickly, I think I looked at that very brief, and I think it's almost represented with, because like all of the plants that I chose are not native, but they can all be grown in Austin, and I looked at the hours of sunlight required.
Yes, but I think there's another layer, another layer of reality beyond just the color block. Like there's going to be wheelbarrows of dirt coming up the elevator.
Yeah,
where's the manure pile? Where's the compost heap? There's no dirt or
to grow trees, apples and pears. Do you know how much depth of soil you will need for that?
Yeah, I know exactly how much. I know that this is what I'm saying. It's even worse than I know for.
So all of your forms and your terracing of floor plates are shown at.
They're each a foot thick. This is what I'm saying. I hate. You're so right. You're completely right. This is all.
That's not even going to support people.
The problem is, like, it makes it worse. I'm not trying to say that it's good. I shouldn't have said anything. But the plotting was conceived as to make the corridor issue even more dramatically terrible, as elevated, as plots, like as planting pots, like just small bearing walls with dirt and fill. And then I know that the apple trees that I was looking at, those mini apple trees, the dwarf apple trees, they need.
But the thing is, you're telling us.
That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to say
Where is
that I
the
think the
section?
issue is
Where
identity.
is your section? You're having
Yeah.
to verbally describe your intention. And what we're seeing visually is a graphic diagram of a formal art. But there's no cross-section that would communicate architecturally what you're describing verbally.
Yes.
So we can see how you were planning to draw this.
The point of telling you is I was trying to communicate wasted
You know,
time
like
on
if
my
you had
part.
shown us all the tree study, you introduced us to your passion about trees, great, love it, super. And then we don't see any trees on your site that would have said, this is why I'm not just filling this urban condition with as much density as possible, which is what I thought the project in general is about. You know, but I'm having to carve away and make those voids to make space for the trees that will hold the ecology that help our city.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Thank you
I
all.
just wanted to add, I hope you looked at the Barbican project in Central London. If not, have a look.
Yes.
Barbican?
Barbican Center.
That's a great.
Well, thank you.
Did you want me to just find it and keep it on the floor? Did you want me to just put my thoughts and stuff on the floor over here? Is that what we're looking
Doesn't
at?
necessarily change. I'm sorry, I'm because I just saw these projects 3 weeks ago, and nothing changed.
I raised chickens. I don't know if bringing them to the second and third floors are great.
Are they gonna like fly, well, it's gonna be messy with urban farming.
And, yes, it's not easy to put things underneath there, especially trees.
Do you think they'll climb up on railings and then fall off?
Oh, I've never seen a chicken climb a railing, but they did.
Yeah, they're so maybe. But like,
If they escape,
like,
Yes, danger.
that'd be it. If the chicken had gone AWOL, maybe.
I'll leave these somewhat more accessible so you guys can actually look at them. All the tops of those come off so you can look inside.
Okay, thank
But
you.
I'll give you a great explanation later. This is a bit of an interesting setup that we have for this, but yeah. Would you prefer if I wrote these out for you on the floor? All of them are on the presentation as well, but if you want to reference back to them or something.
sure.
Okay. Let's just keep this aside then.
There's windows. There's a window. There's one window. And a Murphy bed.
I noticed the first.
Yeah.
There's another one.
All right.
The future is bright.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rohan Rajam, and today I'm going to be presenting my final project for a very fun and exciting design for Urban Ecology Studio today. So in this first image, I just wanted to bring to attention the fact that a lot of what drove the design thesis and idea behind this project is the fact that this part of Austin and the development of housing and residential typologies in this area of Austin especially is becoming incredibly volatile. Large developers are buying up huge swaths of land or taking small parcels of land, consolidating them and making only renter-friendly communities that people are not able to build equity in by buying homes. And it's driving out a historically rich and culturally dense population and kind of making it more of a transient area for a lot of people, young people like, myself and people a little bit older than us, to be descending upon as Austin becomes the greatest next city in America. So this project hopefully aims to consider some of those ideas. I'm not going to say it tackles them in a way where it solves them. This is my best effort at trying to consider those things and maybe see if I can make a little bit of a difference. Ooh, there we go. Okay, so in our initial urban transect study, this is just an analysis of non-human voids in the area. So on this side here, maybe this is still not showing up for some reason, but this area is I-35, and along this area of the street, in the middle of 7th Street. On this side, you have a lot more commercial areas, and obviously in the areas where there's a lot more green space where you're seeing there is more human void, there's more residential area there. But in general, there's not a ton of parks or other green space.
Could you quickly explain non-human void versus human void?
Sure.
I didn't understand that originally.
Absolutely. So in our analysis, the way that we defined non-human voids versus human voids were spaces that were only meant for people to occupy. So any non-human voids were considered places where cars could go, where industry was happening, and it was not meant for only people in their own right as kind of like singular human beings within their own body. So all of these areas are either roads or all of the kind of spaces that you see are maybe areas of commerce or offices, but even then, all the non-human voids are just places where you don't see like people just kind of hanging out as people. And in this area, the non-human voids are a significant enough percentage where it's probably at least over 50% of the area, which is not to say it's a bad thing. Obviously, infrastructure needs to be there for people to be able to get about their business and do what they need to do, but this is just initial interest into that. And this is taking into space some of the green spaces that are in the area. But while it kind of seems like there's a greater concentration of them on the upper side that is more residential, most of those spaces either belong to single-family homes, which are larger single-family homes that have multiple plots of land that have been bought together and consolidated, or that plot over there with that kind of circular area is where the cemetery is, or the memorial is. And on this side, there's a historic site. So none of these areas are areas where people can kind of go to hang out. There's not a lot of parks in this area. And along the entire transect that all of the classes analyzed and studied, there was only one public park, one or two maybe at most, for a pretty significant population here. So this is the site that I was working with. This is a part on 7th and the corner of San Marcos. And in this area currently, there's supposed to be a large office development that's happening. Huge, ugly, boxy, really disgusting. No, truly, it's kind of abhorrent how disgusting the renders are. I wish I had taken some pictures to show you. And in my process of kind of understanding what was going to happen there, I thought about the fact that we start off with the more boxy kind of typology that doesn't really lend itself to being very suitable for homes or residences or for people to be able to make space. And how do we kind of carve away at that to be able to take space back for people, right? To bring space for the community, to make green spaces, and to make residences more possible. So we start off with a superstructure of, a very dense set of grids to kind of represent the fact that dense housing needs to happen. But at the same time, all of that needs to be carved away at slowly and differentiated in different types of housing and different clusters of kind of neighborhoods to be able to create spaces that have lots of green space, lots of different levels, and take advantage of the verticality and the fact that the site may not be large, but even if we densify housing, we can still bring green space back into it without kind of clearing the entire ground plane and kind of flattening everything, getting rid of all the trees, which is important because a lot of the trees in this area are also getting destroyed systematically because of all the developments happening. So my kind of approach to this was going about it with 4 different standardized units. Each of these units can either have 1 or 2 people. There's 2 different single units and 2 shared units. The shared units are just mirrors of each other. And what this allowed me to do was to create a set of units that could be further expanded upon with unitized green spaces to make all kinds of different permutations and combinations of different layerings of these 2 things. And within these green spaces, there's circulation as well as private and public green space. So it's not like it's kind of an addition to the problem where it's like everybody gets their own little plot of land that they get to keep for themselves. So that manifested in this development. And this is a combination of retail and kind of a more clear area in the bottom for public to be able to mingle and to have space, kind of like a park to hang around. And also to encourage people to walk up and through the building and kind of treat the whole building as if it's a park, but including residences and terraces and smaller areas that are more private to allow people to still feel comfortable in their own homes and their own areas. This is just showing it in context of the site. So along this side you have East 7th, and then you have San Marcos over here, and just along this side is where I-35 begins. So it's very, very close to the highway. One thing I will point your attention to is the fact that the building does skew larger on the side that's facing I-35. And that was in an attempt to kind of slowly reduce the narrative and kind of bring it down from a very industrious kind of infrastructurally derived place, being the highway and being a really big access point of connection between the suburb and the city, and bringing it into a more residential space, because I-35 is on this side, and we do get into a more residential side of the neighborhood as we go down. If you're showing it from another view, and a site plan to get a better sense of kind of how the layering works, and the fact that there is still some porosity to allow for existing trees to grow and for light to be able to come down into the different levels of spaces. This is my ground floor plan to give a better sense for understanding how I kind of thought about the circulation throughout the space. So it was important that the space was on a corner, because that means you have two access points of entry, and it makes this area over here very important, because this is a kind of large public area with a big green space in the middle and some trees flanking it. That slowly transitions into this more shared space, which is all surrounded by retail. This is all flex retail space, so it's not meant for anything large. It's not meant for anything that's supposed to be super permanent, but it allows for different businesses to come, kind of have their stays for certain amounts of time and move along, and maybe it's better for small businesses and things like that. And as we move into this area here, you have an even smaller, more private courtyard, which then allows you to get up into the residences throughout the space. And there's two access points of entry because there are residences on both sides. There is an elevator over here just to make sure that, obviously we do take care of ADA accessibility as well. And here's a section with just a render to be able to show kind of how some of the light is filtering down into the space. Obviously, this is only at one time of day. I did have a plan to show another one, but it didn't work out. And I think there's some further resolution that needs to happen there in terms of the pulling and pushing of the green spaces to get more sunlight to be able to come through. Something else that was really important was taking back green spaces and making areas that would have been just pedestrian circulation and turning them into places where you can grow things. So being able to have a garden outside of your home and have a trellis that kind of acts as further surface area to grow things that grow on vines, right, gourds, all kind of stuff like that, but also acting as sun shading as well. And all the interiors are very pared back. They're not meant to be particularly fancy. These are supposed to be more affordable homes. So I think the one thing that I would like to change or resolve from here is maybe the addition of some more natural light. But beyond that, I think the home it suffices for what it needs to do. Obviously, this is a convertible bed that folds up into its space. This area can be flex space that can be used to entertain people, to do work. There's a small kitchen and there's a bathroom over back there. So it's more than enough for one person or two people in the shared unit size. And finally, I just wanted to bring your attention back to this to show that even kind of in the seemingly chaotic nature of the organization of this building, there is an order and there is a kind of grid, a repetitious grid that happens and forms in the overlapping between circulation space, green spaces, and the residential typologies to kind of create this very harmonious community that is meant to kind of function within itself.
Do these fit into that framework or not?
They might, but also this one, This one won't because it needs like the line or something else. Actually, these are different scales. This is at a different size.
But this one is your module.
This is the single module, yes.
So you also have a double module.
Yes.
Go back to your excellent method.
What do you envision living here?
I'm imagining still the kind of people that are coming to Austin now, but with the intention of allowing them the opportunity to afford something that they could stay for an extended period of time, and for it to not be a place of transience, but a place of permanence and community. So still younger professionals, younger people. Obviously, there are not large units available here. There are only single and double units, and even then the double units are not exactly conducive for young family living. Nor is this area particularly, because it is very close to a major highway and lots of other kind of more adult businesses and offices. So I imagine it's still young adults. But I think the intention is for them to kind of want to stick around a little bit more.
It's interesting because you had mentioned the housing prices, and those have been going up for several years now. It seems like the young professionals moving here are fairly affluent because they're driving the pricing up. And so I think it's a really significant question to think about, because you have sort of this conundrum where you're creating these units that are, as you say, very, they're modest. And I'm not sure, it almost feels like these would be rental units. Like, I don't know who is really going to invest in one of these units, or would have the ability to. I don't know anyone making $300,000 salaries buy one. And so it kind of, to me, like, seems like it's, I'm just going to be cynical, I guess. It seems like maybe it's more like the service industry, or which again is sort of like uncomfortable for me to say that, because I think that's sort of the antithesis of what you're trying to achieve, which is to elevate the living experience. So it's something to think very deeply about for this project. I get one question I had about your site planning was, it's your project, I assume, is sort of maxing out the zoning height.
It is.
Have you thought much about what happens when your neighbor starts to do that as well, as far as the quality of the space on this side of the I-35 side of the project?
I think this is about as close and as high as you can go to this side. So there's always going to be an open side to the highway, because the highway is maybe like literally just half a block over.
I'm just talking about this neighbor here. When they develop their 6-story wall, how does that affect your design?
I mean, as it does in every piece of architecture, it's something you can't plan for, and it's something that I guess you can think about, but even then,
most architects that are good do plan for that. I mean, that's the thing. So, I mean, that's why I say this, because that's the west facing. You have a lot of light coming through. There's a lot of stairs that go through there, and it's sort of like, I just imagine your project with a large wall.
I don't know, I think it depends on the type of planning. I mean, let's take something like West Campus, for example, right? Mm-hmm. The developers and people that are designing those apartments know for a fact that every year, 6 to 10 of them are going up, and they're at rapid stages of construction, and they're going to drive up prices exorbitantly for students to live there. But most people live in those apartments with no light, They have tiny little egress windows above their door for code purposes, but they don't get any light in their rooms. So I think it depends on the type of people maybe that are planning these things, right?
Yeah, but I'm just suggesting that maybe that shouldn't be your standard for your design. Like, I think that when we do urban projects, we're always thinking about what the neighbor's going to do, what the view is going to be, how the light is going to change when it's developed. And I think for this project in particular, it could really enrich your design, because then you could say, look, I thought about this development. This is a developer project, actually. And I actually modeled like one of your disgusting buildings you were talking about next door, and this is how I respond. I think it's actually a very logical.
I think maybe one way that I kind of combated that without even realizing it super consciously is I didn't want as many people to have a view of the highway.
I noticed
So if
that,
you
yeah.
notice on this side, there's virtually no windows, there's no fenestrations that are looking to this side of the highway, and there's a greater density of trees even on this area at the lower level. So all of the views are actually kind of pushed, if you're in the back, they're pushed inwards within the courtyard, and if you're on the outside, they're pushed this way looking on the street, because you get a nice view of downtown from that side.
Well, and that prompted my question, because you also have some things that are balconies and exterior stairs. And so I kind of think that there's like this and more intuitive logic of what you're doing based on I-35, but I think you could actually
Expand on that.
Well, yeah, because I think just being critical of your work and just saying, oh, you know what, this may be, there's something going
No,
on.
absolutely.
Is your grid 15 by 15?
17 by 17. I think there's about 6 inches to a foot of a gap on either side for each of the units.
And I realize it's designed for, but you've rendered this construction in a certain way. So is there a kind of construction narrative that these are prefab units that are kind of slotted in to the structure? Are they
I think so.
There is?
I believe so. I think
You believe so?
that was my initial
Yes.
It's a
idea.
great idea.
Should I make the narrative for
It's
you?
a mix of things, because I think I've been inspired by a couple of projects that I've seen where there are companies that build these large grids, and they say, we welcome you to come and buy one of our units and slot it in here, or we have a grid in Atlanta if you want to go slot your box in there, or whatever, right? So maybe one of the possibilities is maybe it's not a massive developmental project that happens all at once. It starts out kind of as this large piece of scaffolding that develops over time, and maybe that in turn kind of influences a narrative of how does it respond, right, to maybe a building that is developed on the other side, right? Maybe it's not all developed at once. But I think that's more of a theoretical logic that, unfortunately, because we do have to have like a real building to show, it's not something that I can, it's not something I can maybe show as much as I can just think about for now.
Okay, but anyway, I think I'm going to bring up Metabolus again, because I'm suspecting every project is going to remind me of a Metabolus project. That there's an interesting question here, I think, which is that the question of flexibility. So let's say the narrative I described is your narrative, for example. And then what you have to do, the structure does not really want to be flexible. Structure wants to account for worst case scenarios where maximum load, right? So it's like you actually design a redundant structure, and you can imagine that as property, as rentals, as the housing crisis here increases, that density is going to be the question, right? So there is actually a scenario in which this has an incredibly dense occupation, right? Which gets rid of all your nice green space because of market demands.
I mean, you saw that was like the kind of one that I started off with,
maybe
right?
landlord wants to maximize, have a bigger return, et cetera, whatever. So in that case, there's this kind of slotting in and out that I think, I don't know, this is the kind of pessimistic me reading this, especially because you're saying this is for young professionals, basically tech bros coming to Austin, right? So you have there's a crane in the center, there's constant moving in and out, because everyone is actually going to be pretty transient, right? They're here for a year or two, or who knows, maybe they go back to California. So there's I was thinking that, this reminded me a lot of Hong Kong units, actually, especially this funny notch here that is really to accommodate going around your structure, right? So presumably this little connection in between has to be built in the field, because otherwise this is not going to slot through in the narrative that I've just said.
Right.
And I'm in terms of performance, these things are rendered wood, but of course if this is a timber structure, then we're in a different kind of magnitude of sizing. And I'm the performance of this is that you really increase the surface area. And so I think the thing that we need in Austin is, this is hot, humid here, right? That we need a lot of cross ventilation. So this is where I'm we're increasing so much surface area. There's a kind of plug and play of services here, that essentially I think there's a maximization. I'm not expecting you to take this on, but I'm thinking out loud the possibility of this scenario, which is that there's a kind of climate efficiency of these units that maybe is the next step where you could take this development. I actually think the attention to the units are fairly livable compared to the previous discussion that we had. And the convoluted kind of green space, I'm curious about, do you have levels other than the ground level? Do you have any level plans, like second, third?
I did, but they weren't as developed in drawing, so I didn't include them.
Or do we have a section somewhere?
There is a rendered section, but it is
There's a
maybe
rendered
not,
section, okay.
I'm not sure if it's as helpful to help you describe your point with the green spaces.
I'm not sure what my point is anymore. Anyway, I'm done.
I appreciate it. It's something to think about for sure.
For me, Rohan, I'm pleased with the way you've taken on the scale of this project with tectonics as an approach to organize yourself, to organize units, and to be able to also kind of push and pull, or, you know, plug and play, whatever the term you want to use, and that you considered contextual conditions as to how you negate those forms. I think that, especially on the corner, I feel like that was handled really well. And I also think that there's plausibility to the units. At greater detail, you could be massaging those a little bit further, or showing us the diversity of how those two unit types really work. But I think it is plausible. And I also think that your attention to living wall systems and green roofs are also in the scale of what is feasible. I think because it's at that level, I can then start to say, well, if you've got green roofs, how are people going to maintain them? How are we going to get up there and access them to make it an amenity, or to make it something that's really part of this project and not just a load of soil up on the top of our roofs that's growing weeds. So I think because it's, in my mind, an accomplished project, I'm going to the next level of expecting you to understand a more or higher resolution section than this.
Absolutely.
And so that's what I would encourage you to do in your free time this summer, is to get into, you know, what 2 or 3 units look like together, and how you actually have a proper section, because you are allowing for thicknesses where necessary. You're, you know, looking at how structure is actually supporting this, you know, how much, I'm not sure I agree with the wood, as much as I love wood, it may not be the system that you're actually, you know, going to be using. But I think that for me, it's where you should be. And it's pleasing in a lot of different moments that I saw through each drawing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. And if you wouldn't mind going back to the plan, I think narrative in your project could be a really powerful tool. Sorry, the final.
Oh, sure.
The one that you showed us. No, not this one.
No. Which plan?
Yeah, aerial.
It may be this one?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
This could work. The narrative of your project, I think, is interesting. It's a very interesting one. We've all touched on, you know, how this could grow and develop, especially in the context of Austin and, you know, house prices fluctuating, and there's an indefiniteness to this. And I would love to see a sequence, you know, maybe you show the structure totally empty, and then next to it, as it grows and develops, a series of drawings would be very interesting to complete that narrative. You have put a lot of thought into your individual unit and efficiency there, and I appreciate that. However, there isn't the same equal thought and efficiency you treated your green spaces. When you started off your description, your presentation, saying, you know, there's a lack of it, we want to bring it back, here's a way to do it, but each dimension matters. You know, when it comes to green space, what you can do in a 6x12 lawn is completely different from what happens in a, you know, wide open space. It's at the entry there, that's more of a pocket park. I would have really liked to see more analysis and study on that scale, equally given to the green spaces as you did the apartment. And I see these strips, and it reminds me of, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, what's going to happen, what's the program that happens here when we have this linear walkway of green. And I think of projects like the High Line, obviously bigger, wider, more robust with planting, but however, it is linear, and you occupy it in a very specific way. People occupy that green space in a very specific way, typically walking through. Sometimes there are benches that you can, one or two people can stop and sort of lounge on, but it's a route, it's a journey which connects different programs on either side and along it. And so again, I think that section, probably a more diagrammatic section showing what these green streets are connecting would be helpful, and to describe how people use them. How are the individuals who work here going to use this green route? Could you put up a couple of lawn chairs up there? Is it great? You know, what is really the scale of that green space on the top of the house? A lot of them are overlooked. People want that, but how can you create more privacy if it is going to be this intimate garden that you want for them? Once you start to dissect them out and analyze the different scales of green spaces, you realize that just a slight incremental change in one direction or the other really does change how that green space is used, just as it does for an interior space that you inhabit. So I think an interrogation of that, rather than just an assumption that because I have this surface and I paint green, would have been nice to see, to really talk about how you want people to use this. I did notice there were some commercial units on the ground floor. What are they? Is it selling clothes?
I think it's kind of a mix of things. So it's like maybe it's obviously not marketed towards, you know, a Starbucks. You're not bringing anything that's going to be franchisable to any one of those places. And the reason that it is so open and kind of unresolved as it is yes, maybe part of it is just an excuse to not have to sit and make, you know, detailed diagrams of cafes and coffee shops and bars. But the very real sense, I mean, it's meant to be a space that, yeah, maybe you invite a certain restaurant or someone to come and take a residency there for 6 to 10 months at a time, or you have a, you know, clothing boutique or a vintage store or a record store. You know, there's all kinds of things you can have.
Yes, agreed. There are all kinds of things that you could have, but you know, I would like to think that there was some thought there on your part preemptively as to how those play a role in creating this community. Because if it is, for example, work units where people who live here can just come and plug in a day, they're not leaving this space. They wake up in their unit, they come down the meandering green walkway or pathway, and they arrive at the space that they're going to work in, which is a garden, which perhaps doesn't need to be an enclosure. It's just a green space with Wi-Fi. And you go there and you lay out your mat and plug in your laptop to the rock outlet, and you can work away. Projects like Archigram, Plug-in City, you should definitely look at that. This was way back. They were envisaging exactly this scenario in a much more fun, exciting, joyful, and just exploratory way into what's an alternative way to live in a city like Austin, a garden city like Austin. And we are very, very, very fortunate to be able to have so many great trees. I would hate to think that you just have your, what is it called right now, the glory strip, I think they call it, which is that strip of grass that's in the median that someone reluctantly comes and mows every 3 months, and you just walk past there, and then you go off to work in your car, just as same as anywhere else. So there's a further exploration and discovery into the potential of this relationship from the plug-and-play unit to these different scales of green space. Perhaps that's the limit to what gets plugged in. You're saying we want the minimum green space to be this size, and there's A, B, C type green space. Don't plug in here because you're going to block that. And so you start to have that be a constraint to the overall expansion of the project.
Yeah. I think one thing, actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because in the beginning, some of the diagrams of the individual plans with the kind of flex green spaces attached to them. When modeling this in Rhino, right, it's just this big slab that you make. You just extrude a big poly surface, and it's like, oh, I have so much green space. And then I have to go and connect them and articulate, okay, how much do I need for circulation? And what is a comfortable width to have two-way walking paths? And if somebody has a dog, or what if somebody's kid is riding their bicycle around here, is there enough space for them to go around the corner? Like, once you think about all that stuff, all of that kind of slowly starts to dissipate a bit. And I think the way to do that, which I found was useful, was creating a set of rules, right? And giving myself that kind of standard of, this is meant to happen here, here, and here. And if it's not happening here, it's happening somewhere else.
Well, I have to speak to representation and drawing. And that's the point of drawing. Everything you just described in your head should be put into a drawing. Have a drawing of a man walking his dog, a kid riding a bike, and show the dimension of how much space they take up. that drawing is the evolution of your design process that eventually leads to your project. You don't just keep it all in your head and then just do a final rendering. Where's the worth? You need to represent those ideas to really have a cohesive project. And it doesn't matter what the texture is in your model. It's not going to, your rendered section doesn't need to be rendered. Don't put time into that. Time into getting those thoughts out of your head and into the paper. That's definitely way more valuable and will teach you more in the long term than what's the angle of the sun.
I have one more comment. There's two projects I think you should look at. There's the new IKEA headquarters in Vienna, which is essentially this, but it's a grid. And I think for me, the question is, if you were gonna have this narrative of total flexibility, then why not just create an entire maxed out chassis and then it develops organically over time? So then you design less, right? You create the possibility for that. And I think the other project is Prect Studio, basically did a version of this. Maybe you're already familiar with that. So I think then for me, the thing is that the system of walkways and stairs, to me, doesn't, or I don't know if there's a formal logic or whatever, it's not apparent to me. And I think that is one of the things that there's a lot of willfulness to this and less systematic thinking in my feelings. So then it then becomes a question of intentions. Am I willfully making something that looks flexible, but is actually really quite inflexible? Or am I creating a system that is organically created over time by the inhabitants?
I have a last comment to the great comments of the reviewers, those missing parts of the presentation. You did mention that there was a research about how the property relationship to the morphology of the neighborhood is related to the history. And I'm very sad not seeing this in your presentation, which brought you those ideas. So just saying architecture, what the comment says is not just land section and renderings. We really need these resources of research where the ideas were developed. It would so much support your project and help to show ideas that you mentioned. You have great ideas when you speak. You mentioned some. Really would like to see that in your presentation, which was missing in the term and stuff like that. And kind of you just reminding that's the originality within the comment, how it responds to the content, how it responds to our developer project. But you did the research within it, yes, and set up a group work, so you grab something in. So that is the value of the concept of the beginning. It would help you also to explain the project. So I really compliment your intention of stepping in to the developer problematic issues, seeing communities disappearing, yes, and appearing large investment logics. So here, let me say as well what the comments were mentioning, how actually you want to make it local, yes, local back within the community. So all the comments, the scenarios you speak, beautiful ideas not visible here, would be so much helping for you. Less explanations, 3 minutes and it's clear by showing the images. As an architect, we create the images, yes. So it's kind of like, well, the other project was more spending compositionally find the strategy, so you kind of more show up as the final result of also formal issues, but not that much paying attention to your conceptual explorations, the research you have done. So I'm just missing this part, yes? But thank you for the presentation.
Absolutely, thank you. Cool.
Where's your office in Austin?
It's on 12th Street. There's the building that Paul had designed, where Lake Plato is, and Chrissy Tenants there now.
Oh, so there's a bunch of you then. Okay, awesome.
It was originally set up to be a more of a artist, I guess more diversity as far as like the type of people there, but
Now it's architects.
yeah, it's really professional architects, a lot of landscape architects. Oops, into can afford the spaces. How about you? Are you practicing and teaching or just?
Not really practicing there, but I'm teaching there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a fellow here.
Do what?
I'm a fellow.
Oh.
I have a 2-year fellowship here.
Oh, nice. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think.
Yes.
Where are you from? Before?
I came from India.
Huh?
So,
You go to there.
No.
Okay. You're just working.
Living there off and on for a long time.
Yeah. I lived for a while.
Hi, my name is Zoe, and this is my project. This is it's like a sectional model of my final model, and then these are kind of my progress models. So, first off was the neighborhood analysis that we did. The top one, the blue and green, shows the program density, with the blue being the private areas and the green being the public areas. And then the more colorful diagram shows the programmatic diversity. And I chose to show these analyses because they show how my section of the street that I studied was more dedicated to residential areas. And you can see the bigger masses are actually apartment complexes, which have like commercial spaces on the bottom of them. And the little star on each of the maps shows the site that I chose, which is kind of like right in the middle of all of this at an intersection. Oh, that was the wrong picture. And here's a picture of the site in Google Maps. It is currently inhabited by a Planned Parenthood building that has been kind of abandoned and closed for quite a while. So I felt that taking over this site would not be too disruptive to the community since it's not really being used.
I thought it was under construction.
Oh, is it under construction?
Okay.
It's hard to tell sometimes.
Sorry. And so here's the site plan that I have. You can see kind of some of the buildings surrounding are labeled as like the various businesses and restaurants. And then right across from the street from my building, there's actually a university. So I was considering the main like demographic for my building to be students, but it's not limited to students. And then for progression, before I get into like my final design that I've come up with, I wanted to show how I got there. On the left is the very beginning models I had of these analyses of between the plates, between the rooms, between the endless, and from there I put materials on them, put plants on them. I put this model into Unity to kind of see the different relationships of the floor plates and the wall plates. And then from there, I finally came up with this idea of a hexagonal unit, and I developed this geometry to kind of repeat and stack in a different way. And I came up with this building, and this is how it would sit on the site at the intersection of E7 and Chacon Street. This picture shows how the main entrance of my building would be open like directly at the corner of the intersection where there's a bus stop, so people can kind of gather there. And it also shows kind of the way that I layered my building with green spaces. So a bigger photo of that. The main idea of my building was, of course, the hexagonal geometry, and then just layering like as much green space as possible into it, since this is like our urban ecologies studio. And then here is the same kind of idea from the back of the building. But that was not supposed to be there, sorry. So I came up with 6 different unit types to fit in this different aggregation of hexagons. I have 4 like one bedroom or a studio space, and then I have 2 that can occupy 2 bedrooms. And the most common unit seen throughout my building would be the studio space. And here's kind of a breakdown of a 2-bedroom and my studio space, so you can see like how all the windows fit into the space.
the arrangement of the furniture and just the breakdown of the floor plan a little more clearly. So in my ground floor, I wanted to, similar to the other apartments in the area, how they have like completely commercial space on the first floor and the rest is residential, I wanted to do a similar idea. So I left all of the first floor open as rentable space for small businesses or cafes for the residents and the neighborhood to come enjoy together. So it kind of creates a sense of community and it's not all limited to residencies. And then the second floor, all the way up, is all dedicated to just the residents, with some shared spaces for the residents to enjoy, but it's not meant for public use. This is the second floor. Oh, and the first floor had about 8 units, and this one also has 8 units. And then as you go up, there will be like less and less units as the floors get smaller, because the way I stacked it, it's like each floor gets smaller so that each floor below it gets enough light and they have green space to enjoy.
What are those mini hexagons?
The mini hexagons?
Yeah, it's
Oh,
offset in the center. What is
those would be my elevator shafts.
that? Oh, okay.
Yes. So, yes. And every unit on each floor plan has access to green space and direct access to either the stairways or the elevator, so it is accessible to like any type of person that wants to live there. This is my 4th floor plan, getting even smaller. And then finally my 5th floor plan, which is solely studio spaces and has the smallest amount of green space compared to the rest of them. And then to kind of better understand the circulation, I made a circulation diagram where the blue shows all the interior floor plate circulation. The gray shows the pathways on the outside as well as the staircases, and all of my staircases are on the exterior of the building. And then I have 2 elevators. One goes through all 5 floors and one only goes through 3 floors because of the way my building is stacked, so that one side is taller than the other. And here's a section which shows kind of on the left would be like the open rentable public spaces or the shared spaces for the residents. In the middle, you can see into this kind of courtyard that I've created, which has a lawn, seating area for like the various cafes that may inhabit the rentable spaces. And then in the right section, you can begin to see like into the units and how the light will flow through them. And it also shows kind of the way that I layered the green spaces throughout the roofs and just like how large they are so people can have a bunch of different activities throughout the building. Here I have an east elevation. This would be the view from Chacon Street. On the left is the screening element I incorporated through my entire elevator shaft, which is also seen like throughout other areas of my building, but I did this just to make sure that light was getting in as many areas as possible because I didn't want to create like a dark space. I wanted everything to be very like warm and inviting. And here is the view from East 7th Street, which is the main road. And then I did a couple perspective renderings. On this like area here, I was envisioning would be like right above the first floor, and there's a little staircase down there you can enter, and this would be like where people could come sit if they got a coffee from the little restaurant below, and they wanted to escape like the busyness that's going on the first floor, and have like a more quiet conversation. And then this is a view from the first floor itself, and there's more seating if people want to be like more in action, sitting right by the lawn. There's planters people can sit on, and then you can also kind of see like how my hexagons are layering over each other. And then, so this is the view of the interior of my building. One of my most common units, the studio space, which I was talking about. It's relatively small. It just has a kitchen, a bathroom, and then the bed is like right there. And then from the other side, you can see they have room for a small seating area. But my main goal in designing this space was to make something that was warm and like comfortable and like kind of more private from the like craziness of the busy street right outside. Because the 7th Street is like the main street in the area. So it's more like a calm space for the residents. And that concludes my presentation. So here's just like a few of the main drawings I had.
Terraces, it's unclear to me what's terrace and what's not terrace in the upper levels. Some of these are outdoor spaces, right? Some of these white hexagons.
Yes. So basically everything that's not within the per-shaped area will be outdoors.
So you can do that way, just pass on that versus the entire building.
But these?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Can I ask a question about maybe some thoughts that you had early in the project? The introduction of the hexagon as just as a way of creating space. How did that come to you?
It was kind of like a random thought. I originally was working with, if I go to the progression photos, I was working with this kind of unit right here in the beginning, which you can see I like started developing further here, and then like I just decided the rectangle was too like uninspiring to me, and I wanted to do something more unique. So
Why you mentioned about light, you can talk about this argument, light and your angle.
yeah,
What you said, just
yeah, the like the way that hexagons are angled, I guess it was like it offered more room for windows along the walls, and then also the way that just the pattern of hexagons, they like interlock kind of perfectly, so I don't need as many corridors as I would if I did like a more regular shape. Like it was just irregular enough to make it interesting, but not like too extreme where it would be hard to work with.
I just wondered because, like, you know, windows are great for light, but they also have views, and some of your plans, they're, especially the studio apartments, you basically have the bed facing the wall. And some of them, the bed faces the window. And I'm just curious as to whether at this level of drawing, whether the hexagon was actually helping you, or was it something that was more of it became a challenge for floor planning purposes?
As I did like begin to break down individual units, it did become a bit of a challenge. I think that's especially noticeable in like the far right unit, how I have like this big space that looks like kind of a lot of space, but
and it makes me wonder if there's a way of, like, I know that this is, you have a certain time frame, but if there would be, I wonder if your project is somewhere between the two, because I agree that there are advantages to having more surface area on the outside the building, and it seems like you were taking advantage of circulation advantages, and but then there are these moments where I feel like there needs to be like an architect step in, and say, okay, this is not working out. We need to adjust our system a bit, because it's used the word interesting, and I don't know about whether it's interesting or not formally, but certainly your ability to, as the architect, to step in and say, I understand when something's not really productive, and just to say, we're gonna change this, we're gonna break the rules. I could see that actually being kind of your next step, because there are advantages to the rectilinear buildings too, right?
Right,
I mean, so it's just something that maybe you can think about or consider as you move on.
I was actually going to ask the same exact question.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, because in your initial, presentation of almost what looked like a completed project, I was completely sold on the way those forms interlocked. And I'm not saying that there isn't merit to the continuation or the switch in geometry that you chose to do, but I I think it takes more than just jumping from one slide to the next to have anyone you're talking to about this work understand the transition that you made. So, Rasa could remember, oh wait, you did it because you had thought there would be better light to, so maybe there's a diagram in there that explains your thinking, critical thinking as to why this big switch has to happen. So I think that it's important to sometimes, like we said in the last project, to document some of your thought process in an important way. Making it very clear as your diagram is usually some of the work that has to be done as a designer in early development to remember, to explain to all of us why.
Very good argument, and also case studies maybe.
Case studies as well.
You chose for some reason you liked it, an aspect, not just formally, but the kind of aspect of the void, right? Yes, maybe. So it's a great argument, and the question is, like, of the decision making, I'm sure you have the influences, but
Right.
section plan and rendering, and
Yes.
you have and throwing away the word, some or ordering, quickly. Sorry to interrupt. A great comment.
I think this page is really illustrative of the limitations of the fidelity to the hexagonal grid, right? Because mainly that you see that the 1 bedroom and the 2 bedroom are the same size. There are 2 hexagons joined together. So the 1 bedroom is a wonderful space. Closet is rather large, right? So you start to see that it's producing awkwardness, the fidelity to the hexagon. Whereas a 2 bedroom, the actual bedroom spaces are quite unequal, right? And so usually developer wants a kind of variety of sizes, right? So 2 bedroom generally has more square feet than a 1 bedroom, and 2, and et cetera. So, and I think actually where you break it at the two bedroom on the far right, it starts to become interesting because I think you can have this hexagonal grid, but then when you break the grid and start to create other geometries, and then you can start to create interlocking geometries within the hexagonal grid that are not necessarily hexagons, which we're seeing here. Although I would say that the awkwardness of the living room space, right, that poses other challenges. So that's a inquiry in of itself. I think this is where the hexagonal grid can start to be generative of something quite new and unexpected, right? Because interesting is coming up. So I think this element of surprise when you're working through it could be another way to take these units in a different direction. And in terms of representation, because this is designed for, I think it would be really useful in the plans to be, you have these rendered green spaces, but I don't see them in the plans, right? So it would be a very easy way for me to be like, oh, that's terrace, that's outdoor space, etc., right? So I can differentiate in the plans.
I think your instincts were fair and true, in that you were trying to shift away from just the pure rectangle, and you found yourself here as a way to solve that sort of niggling feeling that you had. It's interesting because a lot of projects in Hong Kong actually solve density by using crenellation, and they are trying to pack in, just a very, very large number of units. You'll find that the surface becomes multiple facets and cross-shaped, like just to get an extra window into that bedroom on all sides. So you end up with these very, very, very heavily crenellated plans, which at first glance do actually look like hexagons, but then there's a lot of sort of jagged edges to that. So I think you took the step, but then, as has been said, you kind of didn't push yourself that extra level to really interrogate what's the design problem, what am I trying to solve for, how can I do that in an efficient way that won't result in these awkward scenarios, which we did see that you began some of another project. You thought, that's okay, it's awkward, I'm just going to leave it in. There was another iteration to just resolve these awkwardnesses by adding just that extra 90-degree turn. You still get your increase in windows. And I think in your mapping, you would have found actually probably some more interesting resulting shapes by looking at more crenellation on your exterior. There's a very evenness across the overall project. That perspective image that you showed is very credible. It's a buildable project, but there's not much differentiation. I think everything is sort of the same scale and level across the board. And I think your screen is the one architectural element that does start to create some differentiation. I think there could have been an exploration there, like how can I use this to define what is a private balcony versus what is a more open public balcony, and start to sort of really work with using the architecture to differentiate. And just looking at it first pass, I think you just see a lot of very repetitious elements. You know, compared to the richness that you could have gone to.
It seems to be a matter of like a scientist setting up a hypothesis and an experiment. And when that doesn't quite pan out, then kind of tweaking the hypothesis or the experiment to adjust the system. Because in the end, sometimes, I think with your project, there are a lot of successes. First of all, I think the interior rendering looking at the bed is actually quite sophisticated. And you have a good understanding of interior and materiality. But yeah, I think that it's a matter of being critical of your experiment. The parameters that you set up, and being able to say, well, this using rectangles, the parameter of doing that was, in my opinion, boring or something, and you have to decide if you need to tweak that parameter or throw the experiment away and come up with a new hypothesis. Like, hexagons are going to solve my issue completely, and it seems like each solution has its own baggage. Like you're going to inherit negatives for each one. And so I guess my point is maybe when you critique I really think it's wonderful you were critiquing your previous work. Maybe it's more like sometimes you do have to throw out the whole project, I guess, but sometimes you can be very surgical in how you can achieve the lacking, that's missing in the first project. And so if it was about interest or light or whatever the critique was, it makes me wonder if there was a way of, again, I feel like maybe there was an evolution that was missing. So it's not that you may not have ended here, but I kind of feel like this was the in-between one, and there's something that is out here in front of us that you haven't quite gotten to, which I think could be very interesting based on what you shared.
But something that might make the hexagon less discrete in its plan for sure. And I'm really convinced of the elevation that you showed. Did you go to that? Because it starts to, sure, we don't read the hexagon as much as we do in plan. And I really like that about it, but I feel like, to the comments, you could be adding, shading devices or something additive that would go back to how this is also environmentally controlling those spaces through the formwork. And so that's where I could see something of a secondary or tertiary nature that would dissolve away the discrete hexagon, but also add a layer of, southern exposure attention.
So you have a color coding the neighborhood that
The neighborhood
there was blue and gray.
This one?
Yes. Could you comment that shortly?
Sorry, what did you say?
Could you comment that shortly? Because you write in circulation of floor plates. Could you comment that?
Oh, like talk about it?
Yes.
Sorry.
The project has something specific you color coded. Yes, it's just missing.
Yeah. Well, I mean the blue is like the interior spaces, the main floor plates, and then the gray was showing more of like the main circulation, because the blue is like a lot of it is occupied by the private units, so it's not used by everyone, but the gray can be used by anybody in the space. Most of it is outside, but then the elevators are inside.
It looks a bit like here, just shades gray and blue, but we mean it actually have 5 gradients of circulation, which you identify differently. And you have 5 grades of floor plates in order, and the comments are saying also, yes, like we have a is very discrete or very kind of repetition visible in a way of structuring your compositional aspects, how you organize your. But at the end, you have a code where you have like 10 issues you can speak about it, yes, and identify.
Right.
And I think here is very good through the comments is saying that we would like to see those 10 things. Yes? So like you got a code here, you could just spend more time and mention it. Like the yoga situation as a collective aspect is happening here. I identify that area as a landscape, yes? And there is a person which lives in a single smaller space but is still embraced by the void, which is actually socially involves those happenings on the terraces, yes? My intention wasn't that way, to make more transparency or something like give the aspect being surrounded within the city rather than making very huge privacy and saying that. So I love the shading aspects, but as well, beautiful interiors and diversity is happening in here exterior-wise. So I think it's great potential to highlight. You spoke about, you started the plate issues. It was rectangular, but that was a great comment from I'm just giving you are enough design floor, so you're not in advanced design studio, but you have this little beautiful aspects, maybe just forgot to mention or being busy and did not include. So when you think in plates, the hexagon is for you not the main element. It's kind of segmentation and opening and enclosures, creating your diversities, yes? This is what you're mentioning here in those floor plates and graduation of those 5 aspects here. So circulation is not one aspect, yes? So I think the diversity of the alphabets, what we introduced in the beginning, creates the language here, like multiple endless aspects, and could be continued, yes, discovered. Let's make a loop or something like that. I enable that through diversity of navigation. Let's make this, but as well, compliments of trying to show it in your perspectives, but I think you have more. I just wanted to remind you, and it was very good questions. Why did you decide that? Where are the steps between? You thought about it, it's not so visible, but aspects, I think, it comes in a more advanced way in your proposal, rather than just seeing us beautiful renderings. It's a very great aesthetics, but just to mention that. So some kind of drawings like that very much speaks back to your project. It's just like the aspects I mentioned, like plates comes to division and free spacing and diversitizing. Where do you find the boundaries of the areas? Yes, it gives you 5 gradients of axis in order to be private or shared, and multiple aspects you're showing in the render, so you can just speak about it to connect your diagrams to then the visualizations, saying those issues. Yes, intentionally explore that within the story and scenarios, lifestyles that you want to do. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for presentation.
Thank you.
Of course, let me,
Thank you.
yes, yeah, my Wi-Fi started.
I don't know somebody's background, change over the history of some time.
Wait, so we're not, we haven't lived here, we've lived here for years, and so we are part of the change, yeah. So, but our neighborhood is in Cherrywood, which is near our. Oh, is that right? What street are you on? Yeah. Yes, yeah, you get a lot of diversity and a lot of people, especially being so close to the pedestrian traffic. Are you ready? People that live there just yeah, so we really enjoy it there. We're not concerned with big enough. Very pedestrian. You know, we have clients that we should move, we should come over to where we live. It's important.
like a suburban type.
Kind of, yeah.
More
static.
And either communities versus which common to US. Like a, I know that the issues of security facing that, informing and formulating that aspect of having a certain standard and then central locations and diverse people coming into Austin, trying to keep some people still in. I think that opens up novel strategies within the offer like those communities on one high conventional.
No, I've actually been listening. I started.
People who can afford the centers of what happened.
So.
We recognize I'm new to Austin, so I just explore that. You kind of see that the market research intervention. I saw it happened at the beginning. Investor and property relations are really happening. We recognize that densification is happening more. 1 million houses coming in, so more massive there, but intensification is or just tools instead of one. But it's not any density in terms of diversity of lifestyle, bringing more diverse incomes of families, people. Someone would like to live in an apartment as a family, someone would like to live as shared apartment. Those diverse narratives. Look at the East. So that's why I think it's like
it's less established in that regard.
I think the regulation of classical logic is this an opposite strategy by law and rules and regulations. What the East is like exchanging by consolation of investors who buy these plots usually expensive but one single family. So there are 2 different just and you need to get access to it, so I have more paid. Another thing is that hard access to then what is also interesting, grid systems seen in Manhattan and what you can do between 2 streets and then East Austin where you should every minute look left and right, like the segmentation of it's kind of crazy, so I would I was very working, so I would be after you start that I everywhere I go, just circling the cars around. I can share you. No, I was like, where the laptop? Landscape. I find myself interesting and I years ago, moving in East Austin, as long as I private studios, but so from my metropolitan system where I saw it changed by 1 year, so people usually will use to artists coming using unusable spaces, less and less, dark areas of the city. But then investors buy the land, even communities are enclosed, that popular aspect of the city in 1 year time period. But in East Austin, I saw it already happening all the time of period. For 1 million for someone was laid exclusive aspect. So
showing architecture. I say yes, no, yes, no, yes. If I am in conflict with what the other reviewers have said, that I then go to that, and then there's actually something on this, it can sway me, it differently about me, but I don't. It's just like the best voice conditions. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're out of that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I don't think we gave you any of those. Other process that I didn't see advancing because they're really going for a different kind of looking at their process and identical to the AMR's application. Yeah, so if I could do away with the lab, spend so much yeah, I can't think of
Well, yeah, and
fine artists, and that's and also getting to study the philosophy, English,
I just wanted to confirm, like, that's why I was doing
So Jamie, could you please start the presentation?
Okay.
Give you the word.
Hi, my name is Jamie, and this is kind of my project. I guess my goal for a lot of this was to create a building that would unify like the different scales of the busier side of 7th Street and the larger function that that plays, along with the smaller scale, more intimate feeling of the residential neighborhood behind that. So looking into the site a little bit, this is the section along 7th Street that my group analyzed in the beginning of the semester, looking at program diversity and kind of how that changed over time a lot. So you can see to the south of 7th Street, there's a lot of really large buildings which grew and became very multifunctional kind of. There's a lot of really large developing apartments with some commercial spaces on the lower floors. And then there's also to the north of 7th Street, a much smaller single family residential scale going on. And so I kind of wanted to blend these together, and the site that I chose to work with is right here on this map. And in that area, it actually was kind of in the process of being demolished. And I thought it was in this really nice position between those two scales there. So these are kind of my progress throughout designing my units. I was looking at different ways of aggregating different shapes of units and incorporating this angular kind of piece to it. And I thought that that created a really nice spatial kind of condition where in the larger aggregates you had these moments of landscape being created through these connections and these angles, and being able to look out into these larger outdoor spaces. And these are some of the progress models that y'all can see there and pick up. And the units that I ended up creating from this were less angular in themselves, and you'll see the angle come back in later and how the units are connected to each other. But here I went for a more regular shape with two different main unit types, one of them being a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom, the other has 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. And when I aggregated these, they shift along each other to connect in different ways, so that the green spaces that every unit has access to kind of act as these connection moments and circulation kind of throughout the overall building. So this is the site plan of my building and how it kind of comes together as a form. And it's kind of like 3 clusters of units that are connected by these angular pieces that would hopefully create these outdoor public spaces, especially in the front there would be like the most public area. And so that cluster in the front has a commercial space at the lower floor, as well as laundry access and 1-bedroom units making up that piece. And it also gets taller at that cluster than it does at the other 2 clusters to kind of unify it with the scale that's going on across the street from it, with the large scale apartment buildings. And then in the other 2 clusters, you have a mix going on of the 1-bedroom units and the 2-bedroom units. And it gets smaller as it goes backwards towards the small residential alley that backs up to those houses there. This is my ground floor plan. So here you can see kind of the commercial spaces a little bit more, and how those kind of interact with the street facing side. And I was hoping that those would like invite the public in the neighborhood to come into the space and to explore and have access to this green space that was kind of lacking on the site before this. Because before this, it was like totally paved over and not much public greenery was there. And then as my plans go on, you can see kind of the combination of different unit types and also the smaller scale in the back as it starts going higher. There's access to green space throughout as you circulate throughout the building, and it continues to get taller up to the top floor. And here's how that would fit kind of into the site and how it would bring in more green spaces into the area. And then this is kind of a rendering of that front space of the building and how it angles to connect the 2 clusters together and invite the public in, and creates this most public area that I imagine could be used for a variety of purposes. Here I have it as like an extension of the commercial space that could be used as like seating and for dining areas. But I imagined it could also be used for a variety of things, such as performances or farmers markets or anything of the sort. And then here you see the kind of alleyway that goes between the front and the back clusters and how that might be a more intimate, closed-in scale for the residents of the building themselves, so that they would be able to walk along here and interact with each other, to kind of have this semi-public space where they could see each other and be a part of their building, and have the choice of going to more public or more private areas from this alleyway. And then here in section, you can see kind of the connection between two clusters of units and the difference in height and scale of them, which you can also see in this section that cuts the other way. You can see more of the neighborhood in this one and how it moves from the neighborhood scale, the alleyway, and then to the busier street of 7th Street. And then this is just a final rendering of the facade of the site and how you kind of have the combination of green space and public space with the more residential units throughout and how people might inhabit those spaces. Thank you.
Can we go back to the plans?
So in this ground floor plan, I just want to make sure you've got sort of commercial bars at out at the exterior of the project, or?
Those are actually interior, they just don't have the same like screening elements. I wanted to make all of the residential units have like a patio that's kind of screened off from the public to make it kind of more open.
So that's it.
So the rest is glass in the commercial spaces.
And that service corridor that is behind there, what's happening in that zone?
Which zone?
So the unit you just pointed to? Yep. So
right here.
Yeah, there seems to be
yes.
I would think of as a service corridor behind a commercial space. What's happening in there?
Those are mostly the circulation spaces. I started out with like the units which are all on these plates, and the way that they shifted along the plates formed those kind of passageways, those corridors, like you were saying, and those ended up being used for circulation. So you can see in the plans.
Okay. I just thought it was something beneficial that you had done on the ground floor, for the inclusion of commercial with, or mixed use, whatever we want to call it, with residential units, that you're, paying attention to what needs to be servicing such program, and that's
right.
Those items like big trash cans, or getting food for those cafes in and out, that there's a space allotted for that.
Right, I did, I thought about that a little bit. So I wanted it mostly to be slightly more private for the residents there, so they wouldn't have to use such a public entrance. But there's also like here, entrance for, I imagine, like more service persons, employees coming in through this door, while the rest of it would be open for the public to come in there.
Okay, so that is more just for the residents.
Yes.
Okay. You might consider that, someone in that cafe would need to use the restroom, or there might need to be storage,
right,
medical space for that you could say zone with that in between space. So just maybe reconsidering all the things that are necessary. I'm pleased that you're kind of including a mixed use idea at the ground plan, and that you're considering that not everything gets dropped off at the front door.
I think that the project has a real, kind of east-west grain to it, and I can see that based on your program and what you're describing, it's a little problematic on the first floor, because what it seems like you're trying to do is actually connect across the main level. Like this is more of a space that you would have a drink in, and And I think that if you maybe, rather than, like, I think your rendering might show it best. Do you have that up? Yeah, this one. But to really have that connectivity, you actually have to like maybe change the grain of your design on the first floor, where you're actually, this could be a very, like you're showing it a very social space here, but it's cut off by the planting here, and there's another walkway there, and then there's another planting and another. So like, to actually go have to order a drink, you would have to like walk all the way around the interior courtyard to get to that space. And so sometimes when you have a strong grain like you have with the buildings, it actually makes sense to just change that and then start to reconnect spaces, which I think happens also with the darkened corridors we tend to. I think that maybe focusing some attention on what happens between the buildings would be beneficial as a quality. I mean, it's great that you're doing so much light in the perimeter, but those spaces are really suffering a bit right now.
Right.
And they look actually a little dangerous, frankly. I mean, just not a lot of light. You have to walk what looks to be about 40 feet to the first stair, you know, in the dark at night. So I'm not sure that that's like conducive to a safe space or even a very nice space.
Can you go back, can we see second, third, and fourth ones? Are this, so that it's mainly 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms?
Yes. So most of them were based off of the same like rectangular shape that for the 2 bedrooms got doubled and like connected kind of.
I'm very curious about why didn't you just mirror the same 1 bedroom you had? Because when I see these 2 bedrooms up there and there's a bedroom facing this interior corridor, so you essentially don't have a lot of privacy, and it's facing another bedroom that's essentially 5 or 6 feet away from you. Why didn't you just mirror the other ones? Because that's like a very generous, you know, I have my bedroom facing this nice trellis enclosed patio. It seems that the variation in plan really makes the second bedroom suffer a lot, but you've created a quite nice 1 bedroom plan, right? So there's an interesting thing that you don't see a lot in housing developments is this mirroring, right? So again, I guess I keep coming back to this question of modularity, right? Which is the modular aspect of this is you work with a really nice 1 bedroom unit, and then the 2 bedroom merely becomes the addition, the aggregation of that. And actually the connection between the kitchen and the living space is quite narrow, right? We're very much used to like open, modern spaces. And I actually am fine cutting that off, but it seems that this little, it even comes through in some of your renderings, right? This small doorway between the 2 spaces, it's really cleaved, actually. The apartment essentially, it feels almost like in hotel rooms when you connect 2 hotel rooms through that tiny little door. But otherwise, I think the attention to the qualities of the space and the massing, they feel quite nice outwardly when they're facing the perimeter. I think some of the things that come up on the interior are quite valid, right, in terms of the sight lines, and there's kind of like dead-end angles when I look through the model. But I think there's a lot of kind of openness to this, and I think strangely that you can walk all around some units, which to me, that's what I'm reading over there, that unit in the middle seems to really suffer because it doesn't really have much of a sight line or much privacy around it, and there's a little bit of strangeness to that, right? So I think the relationship to the perimeter is something that could be massaged a bit, but I think the essential unit and the simplicity of it is quite commendable, but now it starts to become a little bit about massaging the weirdnesses of the grid that you've created.
Can you go back to the first plan you showed? I'm just gonna be, throw a spanner in the works and say that I think you started out with an interesting idea. I think you go back even, well, this one's fine. I think you had a study of the unit just on its own.
Yes.
And yeah, so this is your module. It's very linear. I think it lends itself to a linear project. And my head is thinking about what's to be gained from this linearity. And there's something really interesting about taking out the circulation space for an efficiency unit and just putting it on the outside. And when I see these, because your doors aren't visible, at first glance, I thought that's what you would do. But you actually have to go out of the bedroom through this exterior space to come back in to the living space. And typically, when you're creating an efficiency unit, you have to leave 36 inches or, passage from one space to another with no furniture, no obstructions, you're talking about ADA clearances. It starts to eat away at how efficient your floor plan can be, and also you always have to consider the circulation part. And so, to me, there was something interesting about actually that bathroom can go all the way to the exterior, and you have this thickened green wall that gives you privacy from the outside, but your primary circulation across this unit is all exterior. And I was like, that's actually really interesting and exciting. And okay, in the morning, your neighbor is going to get a view of you coming out of your bedroom with your bathrobe on and going to the kitchen and grabbing your coffee. And it just starts to create this totally different social situation. And I just think that there's something really interesting to that, pulling all of that circulation into the garden. Obviously, whoever chooses to live here is going to have to totally be on board with that. But is that against the law? Is that a code preventing you from doing that? No, it's a lifestyle choice. And how can you take that through all the way? Your total exterior circulation method. So you're coming straight off the street into this exterior staircase that maybe takes you up 2 or 3 flights only, but everything is played out visibly on the facade. Everyone in this neighborhood can see, they're coming to know it. And it's just this really extreme next door rear window kind of scenario, which I thought was actually pretty intriguing.
As long as they don't wear clothes.
Well, maybe they don't.
Maybe
It's really intriguing.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about that you could keep this open, but what you often see in a lot of spaces like that is people tend to colonize that extra space because extra space is extra space. So there is an opportunity then to allow for that customization where someone could be like, no, I want to enclose this, I need extra space. So this corridor, then there's like an extra little threshold. Say I'm looking at this plan right there. So then this is a little threshold actually to the exterior. So I keep this corridor versus another person who's like, I love going outside all the time, and I'm an exhibitionist, so I want to do this. So there's like a kind of liminality or an in-between threshold space that I think is maybe another way for you to think through this project, because you do have a lot of that linearity everywhere in your project, right? It's not only on the outside of these units, but also on the inside here, right, where you have your staircases and narrow corridors and such. So maybe that's another framing to think through these in-between spaces.
I appreciate the conditions of overhang that you achieved in the end. You haven't just resorted to form being this orthogonal volume without, sort of like attention to the sun and all the lighting conditions. If I look in your, both of the top axons, you really have tried to use light and whenever possible. I think that there's even maybe a few more spaces that could use an opening or two, and that should be reflected in the plan, because even if it's cut above 4 feet and in the upper windows in the kitchen, we should see that in the floor plan as well. I know it sort of breaks that rule of where the cut is, but it's important to show that these aren't just dark corners over here in the plan and in the bedroom. But I really appreciate that you've addressed sort of sunlight coming into the spaces and also the overhang conditions for those exterior spaces.
How wide are your interiors under?
I believe they're 20 feet wide.
I guess maybe the depth.
Oh,
sorry.
They're like 15.
From here to here. Oh, you know what? You're right. That is 15.
I feel like it's just a couple of feet away from being really spectacular. You know what I'm saying? But when you start to have things like maybe even a floating island in the kitchen, and it's really close to having Maybe you have the ability now, but.
Or it's a question of orientation, right? If the kitchen doesn't have to be where it is, if it's rotated 90 degrees, front door in a different place, right? If you start to think of them as zones rather than a very linear living space, which is really rough to do, right? It's like in this layout, I'm like, I don't know where my couch goes, for example. And the corridor, of course, is, if we're talking about efficiency units, there's a lots of very efficient means to make this incredibly usable.
What material do you see your made out of?
I did concrete, mostly with, some wooden elements as well.
This is Untitled in Mexico City, and I think as you said, concrete. I'm trying to remember the name of the architect, and everything is concrete. And the trick there, look at the wiring. It's all sort of pre-cast into the walls to get in and can't go back in later and sort of install the light switch. So it looks as though your interiors are all concrete, which is a beautiful texture, but that will pose some construction challenges.
I'm like thinking of having concrete almost like armature for your project, and then really embracing the idea that maybe these are interchanged. Some people could have more exterior, less interior. And maybe you think of concrete as like, yeah, this sort of structural system that you do your wood and build, and then you can customize everything, and you kind of over time can change, or depending on who the person is living here, change that. I know that that's not what your intent is, but it seems like kind of a logical way of thinking about the project as you know.
I think that would actually help the project to have kind of ordering device in concrete that had some thickness to it that really contrasted what the infill or interior walls were doing, and break down or subdivide the linearity of it.
I just see moments like, the reason I bring that is that there are moments like this, which are all very, very disorganized in a lot of ways, but if they're not, that's why I feel like they're, and the concrete is, you think it is a thicker material, and I think, yeah, as you're saying, like, then you have to address it on the facade as well, and start to think about how that's addressed, and it gives you the ability, in theory, to have longer units, shorter units, something that in 50 years someone renovates and all of a sudden units are getting much larger, much smaller. I don't know, I feel like it definitely can. There's a material logic that's missing, I think, in my mind.
Yeah, look at it, I just remember, it's the Hotel Cadiero in Mexico City. Take a look at that, and showers are concrete, everything is concrete. And just a way to see how that would be and feel in reality. Did you want to live in there? Just check it out and see. And I'm curious, for the bend, where you started off, was one arm the living room and the other was the bedroom? Is that how you were treating the V in your initial module, or did you never get that?
And this one, I didn't come up with like complete floor plans of those, but I was imagining like each of the more solid pieces as being like a unit connected by this.
Sort of like Zoe's project, where you're showing us almost a complete idea, and then we've switched to something very different. And you may not show that process if it doesn't really connect at all.
Right.
I always wonder like what that moment is, remember? Like what?
Let's just wake up one day.
I know, did you just, did you have a review and then you're like, oh, I'm not gonna follow that through?
I just think in this one, like the angles on the interior spaces were making like these really awkward conditions, so I tried to move away from that.
It's just interesting to make so many of them like that, and then just so much
Yeah.
energy. I also wonder if there's in this project, if there would be an ability to start, because you're starting to place in these rectangles away from each other, presumably to let light in and for shade. If there's maybe there's an opportunity because you have such a solid wall to the other side to introduce like skylights or some sort of other element of lighting into this space. You do have windows, which I see, but I'm still not convinced that that's the best space to look into.
Yeah.
Necessarily. I can see it as a light source, like almost like a light bulb. And I just wonder if there's that opportunity. Maybe it doesn't how you detail it. Maybe there's space between the rectangles. Those just stack up and light comes in.
Yeah, the way you have it set up currently, I'm not even fully convinced that you need the 2 layers of units. I'd love to just see this snake, one single wide units going through this commercial zone with its green wall on either side. What does that look like? And then at the moment, it's the snake as well as the egg, and it bulges out, and here's a shed program, and keeps winding its way through this commercial strip, rather than double-sided. Because that's the result. You get this dark corner in the middle, and the rooms that face into that are never going to be very pleasant. But it's an interesting opportunity to occupy super thin interstitial space in this area. I do appreciate how you step down to the neighborhood on the other side and are very aware of the context, the immediate buildings surrounding that, and being able to be respectful of that. Which, there's a positivity there that towers are coming as well. So what if this single wide unit building was 11 stories or 15 stories high, and just green wall around the side, because that's what it's look like, and it's snaking through the 3D long, and the staircase is taking you through, and the core is taking you through 7 locations. And it's just creating this winding path through, and maybe on the 6th floor, there's a green walkway that can take you from one end of the neighborhood to the other, that anyone can use to have a nice way to meander through that's away from the traffic. It's such interesting scenarios. Just by being one unit wide.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was doing with the corridor was trying to create like more of a private circulation for the residents, but I agree, a lot of that created more of a dark, kind of unuseful space, so maybe that's definitely something to consider.
That's the idea that they need to feel like they're using. We need the pretty small library screen. This one, it implies you could have a lawn or something that's social on that level, second level. And then all of a sudden the corridors are very short because you're kind of opening up these 2 legs of the building. And that affects your space between them on the site plan, obviously, but you can use that additional time.
My presentation, I lowered the quality just a little bit, but I uploaded a new one with higher quality. Is it okay if we just download that a little bit? Yeah. Just
Is the restroom
That, yeah.
Thank you. I'll be right back.
Did you get lost?
Not yet. Okay. I will.
Aaron, how many more do we have?
2 more.
Is that okay? You have to leave.
No, I mean, it's just lunch.
Yeah, I know. I think we may run a tiny bit over.
It's supposed to end at 12:30.
I didn't know we were presenting from these, I thought we were putting our own computer.
Oh, okay. That's no way.
So I learned from all of these a little bit, so just say fast.
Are you the professional resident?
No.
We're not saying too. Let's see.
So she's like oh, okay.
Before that.
I'm not sure the exact reason, but it wasn't. It was ended before.
Would you guys like to open it? This is just like a simple massing study. So, hello everyone. My name is Vince Hernandez, and my project is called Greenwood. So, as you can tell by the name, basically what I wanted to do with the project was to kind of be generous to the site and to be responsive completely to the neighborhood around it. And in doing so, I first tried to study like the site itself and kind of a larger study of East Austin rather than individually focusing on our transects, which we had done, but I felt like this related more to my project. So in this study, you can see that mainly it's about accessibility and how you can start to see the potential in which areas of East Austin could be expanded upon and further densified. So in East Austin, we can see that there's less accessibility in terms of comfortability with like pedestrians and also bike routes, things of that sort. So just showing like the locale of the site or where exactly my site is located, I kind of took on, or I had taken on a little bit of a bigger site rather than a site that's closer to I-35. I kind of went a little bit farther to the very farther end of East Austin, but in this site, it's situated right across of a railroad. And what I had noticed when visiting the site was that a lot of the space, there's a lot of potential in further expanding greenery, and also just touching on that potential. And basically, I had first tried to study like a case study of the one seed-long Radistrasse, which is like this housing estate in Zurich, Switzerland. And in this kind of case study, you can see that what I wanted to extract was mainly, I just like the orientation of how these terraces can start to be mirrored across the center, and whether the center could be either circulation or these unit spaces. So you can see it's just, this is one floor of the housing estate, and in this floor plan or this outline, you can see that there's mainly 2 apartments with 2 bedrooms in each of them, and then living spaces and also terraces. So basically I extracted that and I started to see whether or not these central spaces could either be circulation or units or green spaces. So in this one, you can see the circulation is mainly the central floor in which everything revolves around. And you can also start to see like these residences. and how they can be situated with green spaces right next to them. And also in this one, we're starting to expand more upon how you can start to create like different variations. And then in this next little diagram, I showed basically how these spaces can be varied upon whether or not they're public or private or like different levels of intimacies. And in expanding upon that, we start to see whether or not we want to expand it vertically or a little bit longer and start to increase the size of these green spaces. And so in this next picture, you can start to see where I kind of sketch and try to create different variations to how I want to create like a sense of environment. So in this section that you can see, I mainly wanted to create a level of penetrability and also kind of, it's mainly rectilinear as you guys can see, but in this first one, in order to accommodate for the trees and in studying these trees, I wanted to focus on whether or not like different sizes and heights of trees would be accommodated for, specifically with heights of our soil spaces. So in this one, you can see that there's obviously a unit space that could potentially be solidified and made into like a roofscape. And also these areas which are supported by these beams and these columns, in which you can start to see this penetrability changing different spaces. And so this is my like just a render of a Google Earth image. So this right here, the site itself is this entire lot. As you can see, it's pretty big. But this is East 5th Street, and that street is North Pleasant Valley Road, and this is the River Road also. So that's right below one of the transects that we studied, but that's like the HEB, or right above that HEB. And then this is, on the site itself, it's mainly gravel and not much green space, and also a telecommunications service provider, and in that is a Capital Metro bus route. So I felt that this wouldn't disrupt the community as much. And then you can see here I mainly wanted to preserve the trees and start to see whether or not I can start to revolve the design around that building or around the trees. And then basically it's super rectilinear, but I took the trees and started to revolve and around those trees in a way that could accommodate for those trees and start to show a little bit more of the green spaces and how they can expand vertically. Because as you can see in this picture, I wanted to expand it horizontally, or I guess more on the ground, more closer to the ground rather than expanding super high to, or to kind of creates like that urban feeling where it's a little bit too high, and I wanted to create it low to the ground. And then in this floor plan, just a general preface, but I did not like include like the X's for the elevators, but these are the elevator shafts. And then I also didn't include, as you see in the next one, but also in this this floor plan, I wanted to show exactly how these spaces can start to be penetrable in this way, coming from the street, East 5th Street, and North Pleasant also. So these paths can start to show where exactly we enter into these units. But mainly on the first floor, there are no units, mainly commercial space, in which these little kind of placeholders, these boxes are where local farmer markets are, and also potential rentable areas to be able to create like these other commercial spaces. And then as you can see in the second floor and also the third floor is where your units start to arise. And in these units, I did not include the doors, or actually the swings of the doors, but mainly it's these little bit thinner rectangles, and also these windows are the thinner boxes. And then you can start to see where I start to stack the trees, and exactly, I try to pay attention, very close attention to where trees could be placed, specifically on the size of the trees and how they could be placed, or the larger ones could be placed on these more solid spaces. And in this render, I tried to show exactly what the environment could feel. So you can see coming in from, this is from East 5th Street section looking that way, and then these are the spaces, these are the more solidified spaces, and these are the spaces where you kind of enter throughout. And then you have these roof spacing different levels of activation. And then this is just a general render of what I mainly wanted to do was to create like a park space, was to show how exactly I can create that notion of center and how whether or not it's circulation or unit space or green space. Mainly I wanted to treat the entire site as like a center for the community, for it to be kind of like this point of attraction. And then just another axon showing how exactly you can interact with these spaces. And that is all for my presentation.
Did you have a module? Is that repeated?
Which one?
Is that your module? Do you have a module?
Like a unit model?
Just a module that repeats.
Oh, yes, yes.
Looks like that diagram is there with several units in one. Is that the module?
This module is a previous iteration, but this is more closer to my module. But it's basically these unit boxes that are kind of separated from each other.
Let's see your fence. I think the question is, are you repeating an apartment layout, or are these all individually unique?
They're all individually unique. I tried to create not so much a repetitive pattern, and I wanted to create it to where it feels more like this sense of surprise within entering spaces and whether or not it's a unit or it's a solid space for soil and parks.
You have still a repetition, yes?
Yes, yes,
Not,
yes.
not the interiority. Interiority is diverse, but you have segments.
Oh, yes, yes.
So they are repeated. You see, like your widths are like not in terms of unit, but in terms of part of the building, or fragment, or the element of structure. You have a structure of organization of a large. Is something which
Does the massing repeat? You're saying the units are all completely unique. So, but I see similar shapes throughout. So does the shape repeat, but every unit is completely unique?
Not every unit is completely unique. Some of these units are repeated, but I was just mainly talking about like how I aggregated this. So mainly I took units, and I also took circulation space with it and green space, and I started to shift those plates and start to see where they combine. But those are unique in that way.
So you have this kind of two comparison communities. So maybe it would be nice to bring it back for sure. Yes, I just say it. I know what we did, but that's the question.
Oh, yes, sir.
You know what I mean? At the end, we end up plan section and rendering. That I know that you have it, and you have a repeatable segment, but not the unit. Yes, so that was the question.
Yeah, that's the
How you
question.
construct, how you compose, actually, not construct.
Yeah, I guess the
It's not
question is,
structure.
what is the system? Because it seems like there's a system, but we don't know it yet.
Yes. So as a panel, or as a fragment, or as a segment, yes, you have a repetition, but then the diversity of interiority is white, is not repeated.
Oh.
That's what we want to say. Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Is the edge condition that we see here, in fact, what you're intending?
This edge condition?
Yeah.
Yes, that's just the street.
So at the street edge, you go from curb and street to green lawn.
Yes, yes.
I feel like I appreciate the intention of wanting to bring a park to this area or to, an urban condition, that it's not just being completely filled up with the built environment. But I think that there's maybe a balance between the park and built relationship that's a little bit off. This feels like a suburban scheme to me rather than an urban one. And in a studio that is about density, I'm not sure that you've explored the density side of what could be a very sensible and natural project by inserting more of what you're doing. I do find the way you're playing with form and tectonics to be interesting. I don't want to use interesting again, but you know, I just like, it's pleasing. I just want more of it, like a lot more of it. And I think that addressing the edge of the site, which is unique, is a way to start doing that, and that you might treat the internal leftover of where you built out the edges as an urban condition could then be a park scenario that has porosity from the streets and porosity from, you know, what might be the future neighborhoods. I don't believe that this suburban proposal is really what should be how we're thinking about housing now when we're in such need of it.
Yeah, I was actually gonna make the same comment about the suburban relationship, right? You can really see this, there aren't that many units, even though you have a huge site. So do you see how the relationship of green to the unit, which is admirable in many ways, but there's almost so much green. So do you see how it's a really kind of suburban relationship in a kind of urban density scheme? I think for me, the section is really what suffers, because I think, again, light is kind of been an issue for all of these projects, right, in terms of this tessellation and attention to, right, because it's coming from a particular direction. And I wonder if one way is that the floors are like too small, right? There's a way in which you can increase that, and then it starts to really open it up. It feels a bit like a pancake at the moment. And it's kind of an easy way to solve part of that, because I think, although I can see that sometimes the units are at the edge, often they're not, often they're surrounded by green, and then that starts to concern me when you see them stacked up, right? So it's like you have a suburban condition where the house sits in the middle, you know, towards the front of the lot, but then you stack that, but then it's so short that then it's like the overhangs mean that this guy at the bottom doesn't really get so much light, right?
Yeah.
And there is a particular directionality. I think overall for this studio, what I would commend to all of you is that the geometries are incredibly complex, right? So obviously, most of this time was spent really resolving the geometries, creating unique conditions, right? The fact that you're like, they're all unique, I'm like, okay. It's like, how many units did you draw, right? There's kind of a pleasure in repetition, right, in certain cases. So I would say that for not just you, but for all of the students, right, the kind of tweaking of the complexity of geometry is an immense task, right? So a lot of the comments that we're having today are I think, a bit maybe not quite the focus of the studio, right? A lot of it is about geometry, so I applaud that effort.
I do feel like it was definitely a struggle to achieve like that same level of penetrability, but to densify it further, because I tried to densify it a lot more than this, but I just didn't like the overall feel of it. I felt like
too dense.
That might just be preference, but I feel like that definitely was a challenge. I wanted to densify this a lot more, because I think this is about like 40 units with varying in like 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom spaces mainly. But for a site this large, I do definitely say could definitely use a lot more units, especially with just to expand East Austin in general.
Just be calling, or just need more stores to accomplish that.
What I love about your result in the moment of access, actually, which you showed as a reference, was at the very beginning, so that you try to use it, like, not as a geometry in terms of, but like having as a structural element, as a meeting place, like socializing areas, yes, this kind of void of access makes your project unique. And I think the potential of that, like Of course, you are very motivated, so you chose a huge area, so of course for the density comes back to which I said first time doing the project. You need another step to make the density right, yes, in the city you want it, but that approach of the axis becoming an element, yes. The axis becoming a multiplication of the ground to approach as a density issue is amazing. Like I'm saying, it doesn't work, you know it, yes, as a professional, sees with the eyes of thinking in comparison what the developer would do in that plot and what you did, but you have a great potential within that to make it vertical, to multiply the ground out within your axis idea, so which makes not just the cuts in a block, city block, if you will see it, but actually to carve it in and out within this navigation as an add, but also bring the pedestrians walking meeting places in vertical system. That's the great potential in the project, which could be a strategy of densification going more up. Yes, and have an interwoven those socializing areas, these looping areas. As you didn't mention very highly, you loop it through, you go for a walk. It could happen strongly, yes, as a park. Your intention, this is like a park, it becomes for us suburban type due to density, but you could really multiply it, like carving in. It's not expected from you, it's your big motivation to take a huge area, would be expected just a fragment of your project, so it's a compliment for you to be so motivated, and all the issues you have, but one more iteration, you bring in one more semester, yes, from the time of issue, so you have a great aspects. And maybe just rethink, we see our potential, yes? But evaluating that, we would miss the density, but also, I think you are the student which chose the biggest area, so we cannot expect from you in this semester to be correct in that. We didn't set up for you, that's the density we need to reach.
For a site that's large, that's.
So of course, bringing the same amount of work more vertically in a smaller plot will give you more benefit in the central location in Austin, yes, and speak those all idea. So it's just like, yes, choosing a big area.
This, when you place it on the side, and the idea of it being kind of a little bit too suburban has to do with density, and then also the way that it addresses the street. But I almost feel like just changing the program is really not enough. A lot of the projects they just, students just say, oh, this is a shop now, but it's the same basic element as the apartment, the same dimensions. And I feel like, I'll address your project, I feel like you actually could just introduce something that is intermediary and addresses the street and having either retail or office, whatever should be on the street. And that would allow you to have both high quality retail and urban storefront, and then have high quality apartments above that are more, that these proportions are more, I guess, connected to more appropriate for. So I think that maybe that's also something to think about. Is there an architectural plant that's missing from this project that would help address this very, busy street and sidewalk? And maybe then you start thinking about the extension of the sidewalk and how that addresses the park. And I think that would really help. I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention is you have a rendering that's very above. It's looking at some of the roof circulation.
Is it this one?
Yeah. So like, again, I know you're biting off a lot with all of the projects, but I'm thinking about how you can create, or at least insinuate space using things like your page services. And this goes for the rooftop and the ground plane. It's kind of like really just a large version of the rooftop, but it's sort of just, at this point, it seems just like circulation. You're just walking, and that's cool to have that. But if you think of it like you have opportunity for these outdoor rooms, you can program those as well, as opposed to just being passing by. And frankly, in Austin, that's probably going to be a artificial turf or something. But I don't know, it's going to be rough. It could be rough. So thinking about like how you could create outdoor spaces. Something that strategy we're using is like creating, rather than having like glass, because you can also like elevate platforms and that are, that don't go to the edge of it, or then you can have plants growing around, but then all of a sudden you don't necessarily need like guardrails there, and then you sit, and they certainly need to be glass, because what you want to do is create safety, but also visual connection. So there are other strategies to like have that same, to achieve those same goals that are maybe a little more elegant, and then start to provide space and then a community. So you have this area of the ground plane, which is about the neighborhood, and then an area on the roof, which is about the community who lives there. I think that could be a really giving a little more care to those spaces like you did for apartments themselves.
I wanted to touch on what you made about the public-private space. I think in the UK, in Europe in general, there are so many of these multi-family projects, and the unsuccessful projects, in my experience, the ones that didn't do a very good job with separating the public entry from the private entry, giving each individual unit the benefit and integrity of having a clearly demarcated ownership. And I appreciate the desire to try to blur that and make it more democratic and uniform and even. But actually what it does do is prevent you from really knowing where is the private, where is the public, and then both get diminished. And just in by human nature, we want to stake our claim. We want to say, this is my area, this is my lot, this is my unit. But we don't want to fall into the trap of what we've done already, suburban living, where you have walled enclosure, manicured green lawn, and it's taking up all these resources. We want to try and move away from that. This is an opportunity to interrogate how do you define what is the private area while still being community-minded. Still being open to the community. I don't think that this is that open. I see the potential for how it could be there. It's sort of hinting towards trying to address that. But I would definitely encourage you to look at other projects, and one that comes to mind is Pacific Place, and again, Thomas Hedwick. He really uses the ground material to very clearly distinguish which is the commercial entry and where it's a private entry. It's a beautiful gardenscape that just organically becomes a garden, just avoid basalt stone blends up and creates seating. Distinguishing from public pathway to bench to planter, just with very subtle rules in section, and being able to create boundaries and division between where you can go as a private residence, where you can't go as someone public shopping. But all the while creating this landscape that's just shared, and again, very democratic in appearance, but in actual experience, creating very strong boundaries without putting up that wall that says, here's my court that I can occupy, you are allowed to occupy. I just see a lot of those walls, and I know your aspiration is to try to be open and inclusive. So just trying to explore what devices you can use to get to that aspiration architecturally. It could be incorporated into this to actually like a pretty interesting proposal.
It's a very nice comment you mentioned, and you mentioned the garden as an example. I think what I have a question to you, like by discussing, is very interesting. A garden has many uses. Like let me see, when I visited that place, I observed it very differently than I got the tour. Because it was explained, here are residential areas which I haven't seen, and it's kind of hidden.
Yes, yeah.
And I love your comments, like by seeing yes, it's explored, like in the topic of the park as an urban aspect, yes, rather than seeing this as dimensional and the city separate. So you see it like more as a park. And I saw in the market plan, and they did us the tour to explain that this is an navigation, those are the accesses, this is pedestrian, just pedestrian, yes, it is reversed into that. And by the tour, I did not know that there are some residential privacy actually hidden in it, and I would never find them, you know. And so I love this comment you gave, so that the architect has a concept and an idea of clearance, of giving the benefit, but not necessarily making that boundary in terms of the wall. So it's beautiful, what you mentioned, and the references you gave, so it's very lovely comments and seeing the connections. So when I saw the project, I thought like intention is very beautiful, and more clearance, maybe color coding, giving the intention of what we separate, not necessarily having boundaries, giving the logic of setting up the EDS, yes?
Right, exactly. And then we goes back to your point, what are the tools that we use to take that code? What are we going to use this method to find as one of those how to navigate through, rather than just having to paintbrush that paint everything the same, even language. But at the bottom, I also have to add, while it's an important project, definitely look at it as a precedent. There's high cost of the project.
Yes.
Someone has to maintain these projects. It was envisaged as a very equal, egalitarian community, great amenity spaces, shared public spaces in there as well as private. But there's a groundskeeper, someone comes in and it's discarded, and so it's expensive. You know, so that's something we're working on. This is a project project. You know, not everyone's going to be able to work.
The beautiful aspect of the research of East Boston is really nice comment you mentioned that actually the first student presented the in East Austin there are communal ideas of if you take care of the tree, you get a certain money from the city. But remember, we looked at this, so more trees, more benefits you could get. But let's say if you take over, yes, as a person, that model of the bringing back trees in the East Boston, see this reduction. We didn't mention, but this beautiful maintenance idea bringing as an element of national benefit and multiply, making more trees and more people taken care of in terms of benefiting income, you know,
Absolutely.
within the local community. Yeah. Make it stronger, make it as a park of the trees, forest of the trees, because, and this is beautiful what you mentioned, it's very great comment giving in and rethinking it, maybe coming back on some studies we made, but didn't include them. Yeah. Potentially we didn't mention them again. But through your comment, I see potential to bring back the research was done.
I did what you may remember, I did want to just add that Peace Park started in exactly the same way. The community got together and decided to plant a lot of trees about 25 years ago. Before that, it was pretty sparse, and now you go, and it's an incredible collective community project started by just a small group of individuals. Yes, we would go and tend and plant together. It created this identity for new space, and it's an act of the community to get to that.
To bring the social layer in an element of nature, but within the benefit of communal programs, and highlighted that. It's like mentioning this and include huge potentials over the comments.
It's actually a case study that I was studying. I was actually thinking the potential, the residences, that when they buy like a room, they plant their own trees. So this is like, I almost wanted to phase this project, but I had gotten critique in mid-review where it wasn't, this building didn't seem like a phased project. So I kind of like shifted away from that. But I did study that and try to look into it, but I just didn't fully flush it out. Thank you.
Oh, it's some. We have another one here. No. It's, I mean, the lunch is just starting, but.
Yes, so I'm saying the lunch is starting at 1:30.
Yeah.
So if you want to take lunch and have a break, just we should.
Yes, it's up to you, but I just, I'm not being mindful of.
I see these up there. Because we want to take a break and join the other students. So you have now 1 hour time. Yes.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, thank you. It was
Yes, thank you very much for joining. It was lovely to hear all your comments. It was a lot of input from your experience, from your profession, from your insights. It widened
Okay. Oh, my bad. Sorry.
It was very nice meeting you.
Likewise, yeah, likewise. We can bring you into the school more often.
I'm not just like,